Hi everyone, a quick heads up, we're going live in 3, 2, 1. Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. On behalf of Team India Science Festival, I welcome you all to the third edition of ISF under the aegis of the Foundation of Advancing Science and Technology, India. Before we get started, I'd just like to extend a very warm welcome to all of our panelists, the backend moderators, Team Fast India that has joined us. And I'm very, very grateful for all of your time and the efforts that you have put into making this event come live at the festival. My name is Shruti Sundaresan, and on behalf of the entire team, I welcome you all to the flagship event of our SciComm vertical. I sincerely hope that you're all doing well, keeping safe and masking up. And it's great to be able to celebrate science with all of you on this virtual platform. While we would have loved to have all of you with us on an on-ground setting, we've got to try to make the best of what we have. And therefore, the festival is online, and we're really grateful that you've taken the time out on this Saturday evening to join us. I'm going to run everybody through a very quick presentation to tell you all about India Science Festival. And thereafter, we'll get into the course of our events. We have a very exciting lineup of events lined up for everybody. So stay tuned, and I'm just going to share my screen now. So if one of the ISF moderators can just give me a heads up that my screen share is working. Just 1 second.
It's working.
Great. Thank you. Just 1 second. All right, so thank you everyone, and here's welcome you all of you once again to India Science Festival's third edition that's running from the 8th to the 23rd of January, and the festival is themed around continuum. We're going to look at where we've all come from and where we are headed, and we're exploring the past, present, and future of science and tech at this massive celebration of science in India. The festival is going to feature some very exciting talks, fireside chats, panel discussions, workshops, demonstrations, competitions, and games. Everything is absolutely free to attend and will be held over Zoom. So this is an excellent opportunity for everybody to come together, to participate, to network, to learn, share, analyze, compete in very exciting contests, and at the end of the day, celebrate the wonders of science and tech together. Like I mentioned in my introduction, ISF is a flagship event under the science communication vertical of a newly formed organization called FAST India, which stands for the Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology India. ISF aims to celebrate science and connect all of our young minds and the general public with scientists, researchers, public engagement practitioners, media professionals, industry professionals, and innovators. The whole idea of the festival is to bridge the gap between science and society, and this public engagement platform is all about celebrating science. The previous two editions of the festival were held, the first edition was held offline, the second one was online in Jan 2021, and this edition is going to be online yet again, and the theme is that of continuum. These are a couple of really exciting topics that you get to experience at the festival. So we have something for everyone, right from climate change, consciousness, to talking about inclusivity in STEM, exploring the history of science in the global as well as the Indian context, looking at Indian S&T and its contribution to the world, discussing mental health, thinking about the evolution of viruses, looking at how biostatistics have helped during the pandemic, tackling misinformation, looking at 5G and the future of communications, thinking about blockchain technology and artificial intelligence, discussing wildlife conservation, and a lot more. This is just a very quick snapshot of the kind of topics that we're going to cover at the festival. We have some very exciting contests and competitions for everybody, and these are open to kids as well as adults. So one of our contests is, we have a photography competition, we have a meme making competition, we have a quiz contest with the comedian Kumar Varun, and that's going to be held on the 15th. So make sure you tune in for a very fun quiz contest. We have online treasure hunts, escape rooms, jam, Pictionary, drawing contests. Two of our flagship events of Tokyo Thesis and a science fiction writing contest is also going on, and our finalists are very, very ready to present their work to all of you. So make sure you tune in for all of these events and also participate in all of them. The workshops at India Science Festival are incredibly exciting. We have something for that caters to everybody. One of our workshops is in partnership with India Bioscience, and it's all about navigating careers in science. One is about fact-checking in science journalism in partnership with the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. Our PhD program booths in partnership with Cactus Communications will explore science writing, networking, and using social media to market research. We have very fun science improv and science policy workshops too. So do tune in. Everything is absolutely free to attend. All you need to do is head over to our website, click on the program schedule, click on the workshops tab, and register for whichever event you like. You can find a lot of links in the chat. Our ISF moderators will be putting in links in the chat, so make sure to make a note of all of them. We have something for kids as well. So all the parents or guardians or families that are in the Zoom room with us right now, please encourage your kids to join us at the festival too. We have a biofilm making workshop with Talk to a Scientist. Luma World will be opening the whole of 23rd, which is the last day of the festival, for online games in which you can crack codes, play puzzles, and win exciting prizes. We'll have a workshop on building a brain, where we get to build the anatomy of a brain using clay. We'll have Pictionary. We'll get to see an online exhibition of paintings and photographs of brains, and it's going to be very, very exciting. One of our webinars is all about microbes. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they ugly? What's the role of microbes in our lives? Kids can find out at a very interactive webinar at the festival. We also have an astronomy themed workshop on supernovas and stars, which is going to be held tomorrow. So make sure you head over to our website and register for the same. This year, we also have a bunch of really exciting book talks where writers of various types of books will be talking about their process of writing and their inspiration and the kind of stuff that they've come up with this year. And you can see on your screen, we have a variety of books that we're going to cover at the festival. So do make sure to tune in if there's something for everybody at this fest. We had a couple of very exciting pre-fest events, which included a very interesting panel discussion on science fiction and cinema. We had the SciComm Huddle, which was our first science communication conclave, where we invited science communication professionals from all across the globe to come and speak to SciComm enthusiasts in the country. We also had a digital exhibition walkthrough in partnership with our knowledge partners, Science Gallery, Bangalore. After the festival, we have a post-fest event at the National Science Center, New Delhi, where we will be showcasing the top entries of our photography contest. So make sure to participate in the same, and you never know, the top entries could be yours, and we'll actually be putting up an exhibition at the National Science Center. So do participate, and you can see links in the chat. It goes without saying that this festival would not have been possible without the support of our lovely program partners, Social Alpha, National Science Center, Delhi, and the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, Harvard. The three of these organizations have been our program partners and have supported us immensely. So a big thank you to all three of them. Our digitally media partners for this year are Indian Express, and here's extending a very big thanks to them as well for covering our events. The knowledge partners that you can see on your screens have been instrumental in collaborating and co-curating events with us. Talk to a Scientist, Luma World, Science Gallery, Bangalore, Cyrio, Cactus Communications, India Bioscience, India Alliance, Center for Civil Society, Saba Education, Asian Century Foundation, and last but not the least, the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. All of our partners have been very, very supportive, and we're very grateful for all of their help throughout the course of the curation of the festival. Thank you so much for supporting us. Speakers and attendees are joining us from all across the globe. We have some very top class professionals who will be joining us at the festival from all of the countries mentioned on your screen. So this festival is truly global in its sense, and really hope that we get to celebrate science with all of you across these 15 days. Just a couple of housekeeping rules for the events that we have lined up in the next few hours. Please feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A tab on your screens. The chat has been disabled, but the Q&A tab is open, so feel free to drop in some questions over there. We'll try our best to cover them through the course of our festival. Absolutely no profanity or misdemeanor will be tolerated at the festival. ISF reserves the rights to remove attendees from the webinar room, and all of these webinars will be recorded. Thank you. Thank you so much for sticking by. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And before we move on to the next part of our introduction, I'd just like to very quickly launch a poll to know a little more about the attendees who are with us today. So I'm launching some polls on your screens, and if you could just answer them for us, that will be great. There are 3 questions that we have here, just to get to know our attendees a little better. The first question being, can you tell us a little about yourself? The second being a little about your background. And the third being whether this is the first time that you're attending our festival, or have you been associated with us in the previous years? Just wait for 1 more minute for everybody to fill in their responses, and then we'll flash the answers on the screen. Okay, so the results are up on the screen. Most of our attendees are undergraduate students. We also have postgraduate students, PhD postdoc students with us. We have some faculty members and industry professionals joining us. Small number of professionals from the arts and business backgrounds. And of course, maximum number of our attendees are from the life science, biological sciences background. Some are from engineering, some from math, some from science communication, policy, arts, humanities as well, and a few from education. And most of our attendees, 76% of our attendees are attending the festival for the first time. So here's extending a very warm welcome to all of you. And the 24% who are returning for our events, thanks for staying tuned across the 3 years. And we hope that we can live up to your expectations this year too. And with that, I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Varun Agarwal, the founder of India Science Festival and the co-founder of Fast India, to share his vision with us about the festival. Varun, over to you.
Thanks, Shruti. Thanks for introducing everyone to this exciting set of events which we have planned over the next 2 weeks. So I'll just take 5 minutes of everyone's time here and tell them a little about how India Science Fest started and what's the vision of the festival. And actually the journey of India Science Fest started with a book which I wrote now quite a few years back in 2018 called Leading Science and Technology India Next, which looked at the research ecosystem and the science ecosystem in the country and how it could be improved. And one of the things which kind of came out while I was working on the book was that there's a disconnect between the youth and science in country, right? And people really don't understand who is a scientist, how does research happen, and so on. Just to quote one statistics which was there in the book was that 25% of our college students have never read a research paper. 25% of our college students have read a research paper. 75% of our college students don't know what is a research paper, and so on. So ISF basically is an attempt to bring scientists and society face to face. That was the larger idea. And we wanted to do it at a big scale, something at scale which brings society and scientists face to face, where both scientists and society can learn from each other. The first edition of the festival happened a couple of years back. It happened at IISER Pune. that was on ground before the COVID wave started taking over. And just to talk about scale, we saw 13,000 people come up at our first festival, 50 scientists from across the world. And interestingly, when we did a poll of our audience, 43% uh, of the attendees said that they met a scientist for the first time in their lives. And it was actually a very, very interesting festival with people taking selfies with scientists, hogging their attention, asking them questions, and so on, and work pretty much like any festival would work. So the larger idea of India Science Fest has been to embed science into the culture of the country. I mean, that's the best way I would put it to, like we would explore cultures through our festivals, through something like a Spic Mackey, a Comic Con, a trade fair, a Jaipur Lit Fest. We want Science Fest to also take a place among all these different activities, which we explore and put it in the consciousness, in the psyche of the youth of the country, that there's just one forum where you can engage with science uh, in a big way, getting the best of the world, best of the country at one place. Uh, what makes ISF is a few different things which are there in the construct, and I quickly briefly talk about it. I mean, Shruti has already shown you guys the manifestation of it, but how we have thought about it is that if you look at our program, science and technology, core science and technology, the latest and greatest in research, be it AI, be it genetics, be it neuroscience, forms the core of our program. But then around that core is how science interacts with different domains, be it art, be it policy, be it history. All these different interactions are captured. And there are several different ways this manifests in the festival, starting from talks, panel discussions, workshops, uh, competitions, and games. Many games. In fact, this year, as Shruti was saying, that we have Kumar Varun doing a science quiz where we have Kumar Varun and two scientists. One of them is here also, Manu Avasti, who will do a science quiz. And probably this is the first attempt in the country to put a comedian and two scientists together to conduct a science quiz. So that's the kind of unique kind of events we want to build, which are cross-domain and really help bring science in its fullest way to society. Another piece of the construct is to get the best, greatest, and best scientists from the country and across the world, like Shruti was saying, from all across the world, be it Africa, be it USA, be it Europe, be it Southeast Asia, at one place. And these are not only scientists, but science communicators, science practitioners, people who are doing science policy, and so on. So it's almost like a melting point of what's going on in science in the country and across the world. And the team has actually put a lot of effort. It takes us 6 to 9 months to put the festival together, which then wraps up in kind of 2 weeks. So a big thanks to the ISF team for putting this together. Before leaving, the one point I would mention also is that one key part of the construct of ISF is to engage the PhD community, which is the workhorses of research. So we have competitions where PhD students come and present their thesis in 10 minutes to a public audience, and you'll see those talks happening across the festival. We have workshops for PhD students and so on. So this is one community which ISF wants to build together with scientists, faculty, and society. On that note, I'm happy to announce that the third edition of India Science Festival is open and welcome you all to ISF 2022. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Varun. That was a lovely welcome, and thank you for throwing the festival open to all of our attendees. I'd now like to invite Mr. Jayant Krishna, the CEO of Fast India, to please tell our attendees a little about the newly formed organization and what the next session is in terms of the panel and what we have lined up for the festival. So, Mr. Krishna, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Shruti, and thank you, Varun, for a lovely preamble to the India Science Festival 2022. So basically, if you look at the foundation for advancing science and technology in India, of which Fast India is the acronym, this is basically a non-profit organization of excellence, which is dedicated to building, both capacity as well as advancing policy solutions that can foster some kind of a scientific inquiry and research, and in some form, facilitate the creation and dissemination, as well as translation of new scientific knowledge in India. We do it in multiple ways. We've been trying to do it. It's still a new organization. We basically, if you look at the entire science and technology landscape in the country, it does need some transformation. Everybody accepts that. So it's very important to get the necessary buy-in, working very closely with the government. The idea is to revitalize the entire science and technology, and especially the research ecosystem in the country. It could be done in a variety of ways to the best of our understanding. One is, of course, looking at capacity building. How do you develop some meaningful interventions for capacity building in science and technology institutions, in labs, and how do we do it? We try to leverage the global best practices, look at what would apply to India, what won't apply. And we do it, in conjunction with, the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, as well as the Education Ministry, as well as various science and technology ministries, departments. The other valuable vehicle that we have is of policy initiatives. How do we conceive some of these policy initiatives? Not in isolation within FAST, but through engagement with a lot of science leaders in India and abroad, as to what kind of reforms are needed in the science and technology ecosystem, which would really foster research. And our attempt would be to take up more advocacy around them, and also for specific reforms, assist the governments, largely the federal government, to a limited extent, the state government, with the conceptualization, drafting, enactment, and some kind of a rendering implementation assistance during the rollout phase of the reform. That is our intent. And, and of course, to facilitate dissemination of scientific knowledge and create a temper for science and technology in India, for research to really thrive, science and technology research to really thrive in our country. And how do we emerge as a thought leader? FAST India emerges as a thought leader, in science in India, and develop a narrative for its proliferation countrywide through science communication in India. Science Festival is actually a very, very important, it's a flagship event of FAST India. And we're also trying to assist some of the science and technology ministries and institutions, as to how they could lay down, their science communication portfolio, so that science and technology things around STEM reach a wider audience, and more younger minds in the country are enthused about it for taking it up not only during their education as well as later for careers in research. So it's and of course also our intent is to engage very effectively with the industry, because barring a few isolated examples here and there, industry also does not support research as much as it should, kind of a thing. So that's another intent that we have to take up. FAST India, in terms of its promoters, the two of them, Varun, you've already met, who has been a successful startup. And has been a researcher. He studied at MIT, and more than anything else, I think his book that he talked about when he was addressing, that in a way became a pivot around which FAST India was born. And Ashish Dhawan, who's a private equity investor turned philanthropist. He's you all know him as the chairperson of Ashoka University, which is a leading liberal arts university in India, as well as the chairperson of Central Square Foundation. And he's equally passionate as Varun about promoting science and technology in India. And, we have a whole lot of, advisors like Luis Miranda, of the Center for Civil Society, Dr. Sanjay Sharma from MIT, Vijay Chandru, who's a computer scientist, Venkatesh Narayan Murthy from Howard, Dr. Swaminathan Shivaram from the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Thomas Barlow from Australia, who's advisor on science and technology research, and Chris Gopalakrishnan, one of the co-founders of Infosys. Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who's incidentally also a panelist this evening for this session from CMC Vellore. Dr. Samir Brahmachari, who's the former DG of CSIR, Kiran Majumdar-Shaw. We all know about the work her company has done in the biotechnology space, So I think I can go on and on, but looking at respecting the time, I think it's important to introduce the topic that we have for the panel discussion starting in a short while. We welcome all the panelists on a very, very important topic as to how do we lay down the foundation for next gen in STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in India, and it applies to education as well as for subsequent careers in science and technology. And who could have been a better person than Dr. K. Vijayaraghavan, the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, as a panelist for this session. We also all know him as the PSA, but he was also the Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, Government of India earlier. He was also the Director of National Center for Biological Sciences of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, TIFR. As well as for some time, he headed DBT's Institute of Stem Cell Biology and Regenerative Medicine. He has made huge contribution in science, largely as a developmental biologist, and now he's at the helm of affairs of science and technology in the country, because bulk of science and technology in our country happens in government labs. He's also the fellow of the Indian National Science Academy and the Indian Academy of Sciences. And as a matter of fact, he's
We're getting into our panel discussion time.
Yeah, I know, Dr. Raghavan. I've tried to be as brief as possible. Otherwise, the entire panel discussion time would be taken away by introducing such an illustrious team of panelists. And he has been elected as the only Indian, as a matter of fact, to be elected as an associate member of the European Molecular Biology Organization.
Not true anymore.
I said, yeah, that's and he was also elected a fellow of the Royal Society. A lot of I will not even attempt to read his honors and awards that he has won, but some of the important ones are the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award, Infosys Prize for Life Sciences, as well as Padma Shri in the year 2013 for his immense contribution to nation building through science and technology. Not in any particular order, let me introduce Dr. Gagandeep Kang to you, who's also on our advisory board of FAST India. She's a microbiologist as well as a virologist and a professor of gastrointestinal sciences at CMC Vellore. She has been a leading practitioner and her research has focused on viral infections in children and testing of rotaviral vaccines. Like Dr. Raghavan, she has also been the Infosys Life Sciences Prize winner. And her contribution has been huge in understanding the natural history of rotavirus and other diseases which are of infectious nature. She was the first woman to be elected to as the fellow of the Royal Society, and she co-authored the book which is called Till We Win, India's Fight Against the COVID-19 Pandemic. And as most of you would have seen, she was one of the most prominent scientists in the country, who was engaging regularly with the media and public at large, not just to spread knowledge, which was so critical during the pandemic, which still is, as well as to fight misinformation. So welcome, Dr. Gagandeep Kang. May I request all the panelists to switch on, their videos as well, Wonderful. Dr. Jyotsna Dhawan is the CEO of DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance. She has very rich research experience in leadership positions for over 25 years, at the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, Hyderabad. Her focus has been on muscle stem cells, and she was also involved in setting up a DBT's Institute for Stem Cell Science and Regenerative Medicine in Bangalore. And her research focus has been on molecular mechanisms by which dormancy and quiescence contributes to adults' stem cell function and skeletal muscle repair. Then let me introduce Dr. Karishma Kaushik to you. Dr. Karishma Kaushik is a physician turned scientist, and she did her MD in clinical microbiology from AFMC Pune. And as a doctor, she chose the career of a researcher and did her PhD in molecular genetics and microbiology from University of Texas, Austin, where she also taught for some time. And a few years ago, she returned to India as a Ramalinga Swami Fellow and set up her own research group at the University of Pune. And her theme of research has been on human relevant infection biology that aims to bridge the gap between studying infectious disease models in mice and application of such research in human beings. And more interestingly, she's a co-founder of a talk from a science communication perspective a talk to be co-founder of Talk to a Scientist, which is one of a kind interactive weekly webinar-based outreach platform for igniting young minds towards science and technology in India. So thank you, Dr. Karishma. And last but not the least is Dr. Manu Avasthi, who's a PhD from University of Utah, and earlier he did his BTech from computer science in IIT BHU, which is now IIT BHU Varanasi. He teaches at Ashoka University now. Before that, he was at IIT Gandhinagar. He was teaching computer science there. He has been with the Micron's architecture definition group and also the Samsung's memory solution lab in California. And with a lot of work that he has done in next-gen memory as well as storage devices and systems, there are lots of fellowships he has got. The list is long, but I think more importantly for us, he has been championing the cause of capacity building in STEM, and very well known for creating memes for social media. So welcome, Dr. Manu Avasthi. I won't take a lot of time. As I introduced the topic to you, very, very clearly, the choice we have that, through a prism of timelessness, we can reiterate, as to what ails our STEM education as well as research landscape in the country. But I won't do that because I essentially see the glass not as half empty, but as half full. There's a lot of positive, energy in India as a country and our science and technology landscape. If you look at, we are by PPP, the third largest economy in the world. In absolute terms, by nominal GDP, we're the sixth largest economy. Surely a big enough science and base to support science and technology. A base of 1,000 universities, 10,000 science colleges, 15 lakh schools, ISC, 23 IITs, 31 NITs, 7 IISERs. There is no dearth for careers in serious research in India. We have the world's third largest base of startups, where also a lot of cutting edge innovation is happening, including 53 unicorns, which we have, who now have the capacity to invest in research big time. Huge set of government labs, 38 CSIR labs, 64 ICR labs, 50 DRDO labs, and almost 21 ISRO centers, 5 atomic energy centers. I mean, the list is long. If at all we run these bodies, these institutes and labs on global standards, it could surely catapult India's science and technology research throughput to a much, much higher achievement trajectory for the country, solving lots of challenges for the country, which are relevant to the country yet not solved. We have 86% tele-density, 54% smartphone penetration, and almost 80 crore internet users. These are all they augur very well for adoption of technology, as we saw during the COVID time, and also our research, our homegrown vaccines. NEP the new education policy 2020 has huge opportunities as it has laid the focus on only research universities, as well as the formation of National Research Foundation with an outlay of 50,000 crores spread over 5 years. No, I see it as a never before opportunity to commence the transformation of science and technology research in our country. Anywhere you look at, 12 to 15% of scientists in the US and UK are immigrants from India, first generation immigrants from India. Indian students form the second highest population of students in countries like US, UK, and Singapore, and so on and so forth. Not just Microsoft and Google, almost half of the top 20 tech giants in the world, they are led by people of Indian origin, and not, whose parents had migrated, who did their first degree in India and then went for their master's abroad and then started working. So I see, as a huge opportunity, for this kind of a reform to happen in our country. And my first question to Dr. Vijay Raghavan is essentially, I see it as as a very exciting time for sciences in India to thrive. Do you agree with it? If yes, then why? And if not, then why, Dr. Raghavan? Who could be a better person in the country to answer that?
Thank you, Jayant, for delivering my talk. Let me just give some concluding remarks. The challenges we face, despite all these enormous advantages, are such that unless we grasp them and deal with them soon, we will let opportunities slip and snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. What are our challenges? And you sort of detailed them out. I won't repeat that. You put them in terms of opportunities. Let me put them in terms of imperatives. Today, we have within India a France and a Germany in terms of science, technology, engineering, and medicine, and some of the most difficult, lowest or middle income countries in terms of science and technology. So we have this combination. This combination is there in an interesting manner. It is in a salt and pepper manner distributed all over the country. And if you look at the pepper as our top institutions, you have them all over the country, all the labs you mentioned. Adjacent to them, walking distance, are all our other universities, where Varun mentioned, for example, that you don't read a research paper as an undergraduate. So you have the salt and pepper situation, and no matter how much water you pour on the system, the pepper doesn't dissolve and merge with the salt. You needed that pepper formation to build excellence. Some amount of isolation is good to build excellence. But now there needs to be a way by which we can break that excellence. So in terms of, sorry, not excellence, my apologies. We can break that barrier, that isolation which is there, which you use to build excellence. And therefore, what you need is a way by which these research labs are integrated with our university system, both geographically and thematically. For that, I would say we should have a situation beginning soon from about 10 to 20% of their funding. But after that, about 70% of their funding should be spent in the research ecosystem with their units embedded in their university system. So that's one about mixing labs and universities. The second point is about our research institutions right now. While they indeed have extraordinary competence, there is a big challenge in their not having institutional comprehension. In other words, they are a collection of competences like a real high quality termite hill, but the comprehension of the organization of that hill is not there. In some ways, it's a good thing. You don't want a top-down comprehension thrust on institutions saying that this is what you will do. Then you don't perform. The other extreme is if everyone has a comprehension of what needs to be done at their individual researcher level, then you're really talking about a university environment and not a research institution environment. So somehow you need to have the focus and drive of a research institutions. And I use examples like the Lawrence Berkeley labs or the Bell labs and so on. Each have their strengths and weaknesses, but we need to get that ability into our research institutions while partnering with the ecosystem. Now, this combination of linking our institutions with the broader ecosystem and with the institutional transformation internally itself is eminently feasible. It requires substantial will from within And if it doesn't get resolved from within, it needlessly gets resolved in a clunky manner from outside. So that's the top priority for all of our scientists, I would say. The second priority for this salt and pepper to mix is having all our education at the higher level bilingual. You should be able to listen to and this is a big challenge in national institutions. You should be able to listen to a talk in any language of your choice in class and read a textbook bilingually in English and any other language. If you're not listening to a talk in your language, at least have a speech to text translation in your language available. And this is increasingly becoming feasible at a mind-boggling pace. And while you will lose nuances, for example, if you're listening to Shakespeare or Anna Karenina, a literal translation by a computer is no good. But for many other aspects, functionally, it can be very valuable. Primarily, it gives you the power of abstraction which you have in your own language, and you lose if you have to master another language. If you have to master another language to do well, many people do it, they're very talented or driven, but you're really shutting off the opportunity for a girl in Chhattisgarh to become a gravitational astronomer, and that is not right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, for some very useful ideas around that. May I now move to Dr. Gagandeep Kang? And before, just a request to all panelists. Let me suggest that towards the end, if you could just list down 2 or 3 top ideas, top of the mind ideas that you have. What's your wish list for STEM, both education and from a research landscape perspective, to change in foreseeable future? If you could have your wish list ready, that be common question. I would ask all the panelists towards the end of the panel discussion. So, Dr. Kang, the simple question that I have to you is that how we as a nation are doing to build the capacity in STEM. Do you see us moving in the right direction, both in education and careers? And what do you see as some top hits as well as misses?
So I think if we think about what has worked well, the islands of excellence, the pepper that Dr. Vijay Raghavan talked about, has worked reasonably well. If you look at what the IITs produce, what the organization that Jyotsna is heading produces, these are really outstanding people across a range of disciplines. But the problem really is, once you're finished with your IITs, not so much for the India Alliance, which has a continuum of support for people if they are deserving. Where do you go? And what is the environment that you are offered then? I don't think it's an accident that 10 out of the top 20 tech companies in the world are headed by Indians. Because we are 1/6 of the world's population. We give people that study at the best institutions a leg up in terms of their training. And if you succeed in India, the competition to get into these institutions is incredible. If you succeed in India, you're likely to succeed anywhere in the world, because the competition at least post-undergraduate level is heaviest in India. So I think when we think about what we want to do to keep our best and brightest in India, we need to think about the environment that we have for them, what we create as enabling mechanisms. And to me, one of the biggest things that we don't recognize is how much time is wasted in India. So if you look at a scientific career in India, I don't think anyone does time motion studies for this. How much is spent on science? How much is spent on bureaucracy? And what else, how does that compare with the rest of the world? There are some institutions that take the burden of administration and on themselves, create supportive structures, but those, even among the pepper, are few and far between. So I think thinking about that and making sure that we evaluate what the pain points are and what we need to do to address them is absolutely critical. If we think about resources, globally, the government is the largest investor in research. You do have a much larger proportion of R&D investment that happens from companies or industry, but it's still government that funds the most. And I think benchmarking where we are and following through on that is absolutely critical. And the benchmark should include how we facilitate industry to also invest in research. So there are some hits that have resulted in exports, some hits that have resulted in excellence within the country, some institutions that have really attracted the best back. But at the moment, a lot more misses, and doing an evaluation of why these misses exist would be very helpful.
So thank you, Dr. Kang. I really liked, especially your suggestion that, do we do a time and motion study for, the throughput of a scientist, how much of time they spend on core science and technology and how much on the bureaucracy, and how do we cut the bureaucracy element and increase their productive time on scientific research. Thank you. May I now go to, Dr. Jyotsna Dhawan. So drawing from your experiences, Jyotsna, what do you see as some of the critical challenges in the path of doing high quality science research in India, Jyotsna? You have to unmute, Jyotsna.
I recognize that. Hi, thank you for having me on the panel. There are many challenges, but many paths towards what you consider high quality research. So I think, the fact is we have these wonderful institutions which have capacities for doing research in exploring the world around us. But we also have a large variety of places where there are people who are instinctively capable of doing research at those high levels, but simply don't have the enablement to be able to get there. And I think this is a big challenge, because while one wants to ensure that the elite institutions which are world-class exist, and the pepper that Vijay was talking about, how does one also ensure that there is an egalitarian way to spread the capability for being able to access a path to research? I think it's very difficult. One possible way is that, among the programs that we fund, which are these essentially funding the best and the brightest, is to ensure that you also have built in as part of the funding funds that enable outreach to programs that are less well funded. And this means actually reaching out to the people around you in universities and other organizations around you. And, so that's one thing. The other thing is, I think what we seem to also lack, in addition to, we have large amounts of funds which are coming in from the government as well as from private sources for a variety of programs. But perhaps what we need is a change of attitude as well. And one of the things that I think we seem to focus on is the notion of success as this linear path. I think that success is bundled in with the ability to recognize failure and the lessons of failure. And we need some ability to have the freedom to fail in order to work through those things. And I think young people in particular are, not sufficiently appreciated for these abilities to work through failure, because our system is not forgiving of those, of the notion of failure. So I think we need to have a change in attitude in addition to all of the programs that we are enabling at multiple different levels, right? Because that, at the end of the day, that's what's going to allow those programs to be successful and implementable. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josna. Some very useful inputs, and especially I liked your comment that, our system is not engineered to accept failure. As they say, sweet are the uses of adversity. And there's a huge amount of learning from failures. Lessons learned teach you far more than the best practices, picked up from elsewhere. But we as a system we have to have enough window for accepting failures and actually encouraging them that, yes, that's a part of the process. Not every intervention can be successful. Thank you. And so over to, Dr. Manu Avasthi. My question to you is, Dr. Kang also mentioned that, IITs have such a rigorous selection process. And, if you have, been able to crack that, you can perhaps get into any institution or do wonders anywhere in the world. But it's also true if you look at IITs, the best of breed students that IITs attract are in the undergrad. Master's students are a few notches lower than undergrad students the IITs attract, and PhD students are even several notches below the master's students. So how do you what to your mind we as a country need to do that we retain that talent and even at the master's level and the doctoral level and even the postdoctoral level we keep those students within, we create the right system, the right ecosystem, the right environment for research to thrive. What needs to be done to your mind, Dr. Manu? Since you're also a product of IIT system like Dr. Raghavan.
All right. Thanks, Jen, for having me on. So let me just, since you mentioned IITs, let me just quickly comment on the fact that the undergraduate students, the undergraduate population in the IITs is a very, very tiny fraction of the total undergraduate population in India, right? So, of course, they get the best possible education, they get the best possible resources, and that is also a function of the kind of support that the institutions themselves get from multiple quarters, which essentially probably 95% of the students don't get, right? Overall IITs only have 18,000 or so undergraduate students that they take in every year, which is basically, if you look at the larger context of the country, this is a very, very tiny fraction, right? So that's point one. The other point that you mentioned about retaining students back in India at both the master's, the doctoral, and the postdoctoral level, essentially goes back to one belief that I have, right? If you look at research that is being done, all the projects, all the funding aside, research is done by people, right? It's the PhD students, it's the postdoctoral fellows, it's the staff scientists who actually do all the research that is ever done, not just in India, everywhere else, right? And then building a good research ecosystem essentially boils down to taking care of people who are actually doing the research, right? And that includes academics, that includes faculty, that includes principal investigators as various research labs, so on and so forth, right? So the idea here is that whatever it is that we do, irrespective of how much money the government puts in, how much money the industry puts in, until and unless we are, as a country, as a conglomerate of all the academic institutions are there, we're not able to take, as long as we are able to take care of these students, for example, PhD students, paying them a living wage, or paying their stipends on time, for example. I mean, that is a big thing that is that has essentially not been solved yet. So again, the point is that we need the funding. Coming back to funding as well, to some extent, we sort of need to be in a mode where we are throwing money at the problem for a significant amount of time, at least, right? And this is essentially what China has done over the past 25 years, where they have just invested so much money into building up their institutions. And then this is not just the pepper higher tier institutions that Dr. Raghavan was talking about, but essentially throughout the pyramid, tier 2, tier 3, whoever else, they have just poured in money to build infrastructure across the pyramid and kind of brought in people at all levels, right? So that has something that has not just happened in India as of yet. I mean, although the amount of funding that is coming from government sources, from the industry, everything has been increasing over time, it has not been able to match the level at which, people don't have to sort of worry too much about, hiring people or paying their salaries on time and so on and so forth, right? So to some extent, all this boils down to is essentially making sure that people who do the research, people, who are faculty, who are staff, who are PhD students, staff scientists, are taken well care of. And that requires changes at multiple levels. You have to put more money into the system. You have to make sure that there is institutional accountability from the funding agencies as well as the actual institutions where these people are attached to, so that they're, things like salaries are getting paid on time, things like release of grants by various funding agencies is made on time, so that these salaries can essentially be paid on time, right? So I personally know of so many cases where people who do want to do good research and stay in India have decided to not do it because of these very basic things that are not being done. And you can't really blame them for taking, decisions that they take them outside of the country.
Thank you, Manu. Very useful. And many of these problems that you narrated are solvable problems. They are not rocket science. Why can't we release the stipend of research scholars on time? Why can't we, even the grant money, why is it that, lab after lab complains that, bulk of that money comes during part of the year and then becomes a huge cycle, huge challenge, how to meet the working capital requirements and things like that. We could surely do corrections because the money exists in the system, right? If it didn't exist, how are eventually the payments made? So it's not a question of non-availability of funds, but these are clearly solvable problems. Thank you, Manu, for very, very useful inputs. Now I switch to Dr. Karishma Kaushik. Since this platform that you runs, Talk to a Scientist, share with you in the earlier two ISFs, based on the surveys that we did, majority of the students, especially the science and technology students, they said that they are meeting a scientist for the first time in their lives, through India Science Festival. First time, can you imagine? Majority of them, and these scientists can inspire young minds, can ignite their minds big time, So what we as a nation can do to institutionalize science communications, especially since your initiative is there, therefore leaving aside all other questions, parking them somewhere, I'll request Karishma, you to focus on that.
Thank you, Jayant. But I would mention a few points in continuation with what the four panelists have spoken. I think all of this could come under, before I talk of my passion project, which is Talk to a Scientist. I'm also a scientist in my day job. So I think I will comment a little bit about what's been spoken before. I think all of this comes under ease of doing research. In India, we talk a lot about ease of doing business, but administrative processes, paperwork, fellowships being paid on time, positions being created, positions being renewed, all of this comes under ease of doing research, which we have to prioritize and focus yesterday, if needed, in the Indian science community. We cannot expect thought-provoking science, pondering questions when somebody is worried about their next fellowship payment going through at student level. At early career researcher level, we really can't expect high output science when we are worried about our extensions, when we are worried about whether grants will come through. So for this one thing, I think we can look to see systems that have solved it and try and replicate those processes that have managed to get dispersals out on time, dispersals without enormous amount of paperwork involved. Because these are pain points, like what Gagandeep mentioned. These are pain points in Indian science which are unsolved, unfortunately. The other aspect to doing science in India is the problem of missing personnel. We simply haven't invested in building in what I see as two groups of people. One is the postdoc community, who are extremely well trained, and we want to hold them back. While I'm a beneficiary of the Ramalinga Swamy project, I think taking it further is, why don't we hold them back in India? So we don't have a postdoc community sufficiently supported, and we don't have staff scientists in India sufficiently supported to help larger labs actually focus on the science, and while they take care of many other technical aspects. So if India Alliance can look at programs that would specifically support these, what I would call missing personnel in Indian science, it would be game changing as early career researchers set up their establishments. All right, I think with that, I'll come to talk to a scientist. So it was a pandemic project, a passion project. We intended to go to schools. That never happened because of March 2020. We all know what happened after that. We decided to turn it online. So digital connectivity in the last 2 years has been forced on us, but it's also provided unprecedented opportunities for scientists to basically reach out to communities. And I would say there are no excuses left anymore. Not only because the pandemic has made people look to scientists for answers and made scientists the center of this global national discussion on dealing with the pandemic, but also because now we have digital tools with which we can engage. What I think we did get the India Bioscience Outreach Grant, and I also know that India Alliance supports a lot of outreach initiatives, which was tremendous, because if not for the IOG, the outreach grant, this money would basically have gone from our pockets. We would have happily done it anyway, but IOG gave us the platform. It gave us the formal structure to build this outreach program. What I think is missing when I talk to my colleagues, and this would be my last point here, is I think there is no value or assessment of one's time spent on these activities. If it is not at some honest level, when everyone wants promotions, grants, awards, move up the ladder, the academic ladder, there aren't enough systems in place to value and appreciate time spent on this. And if that can be built into promotions and assessments, it would definitely allow a lot of early career researchers to basically say, look, I'm passionate about doing it, but it shouldn't affect my career path, because finally that puts the bread on the table.
Yeah. Thank you, Karishma. I really appreciate your thoughts, especially on improving ease of doing research on the lines of ease of doing business. Let me tell you that Fast India is making every endeavor. We are yet to start work on that, let me confess, but it's our intention that, could we develop that into an indices, have measurements in place, if the ease of doing research in India has to improve. That's what we, and wonderful ideas, these are practically, what I would like to ask all panelists at the end, that what are the top 2, top 3 ideas? You said the missing layer of staff scientists, and of course the postdoc community. These are big gaps. Thank you for these wonderful suggestions. So now over to Dr. Vijay Raghavan, the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India. Since I know for sure that, sir, you are a reformer at heart. Therefore, I wanted to ask you the next question. If you look at historically, our universities and our science and technology labs and institutions evolved in a certain manner for some reasons, best known to our founding fathers. They were always created into separate universes. Unlike many other countries in the US and UK, labs and these scientific institutions, most of them, if not all, they are a part of the university ecosystem itself. in our country, for some reason, we created them as two independent entities. And therefore, over a period of time, we have created a situation where they hardly talk to each other, at a time when the research all over the world is becoming more cross-domain, more interdisciplinary. We have created so many, pockets, isolated pockets in the country. I'm aware of some of the initiatives you have taken to create geography clusters, but is there any other way of bringing, these the institutions of higher learning and scientific research together closely for us to be able to solve the critical problems which we as a country face? Over to you, Dr. Raghavan.
Thank you, Jayant. Let me address this problem in two components, but first comment on some of the aspects which you have discussed earlier. The obvious inefficiencies in resources reaching their targets in a steady manner is a problem which our research agencies need to sort out, and they're grappling with it, and I hope that gets done. That's very important. But the other side of it is also important, may not be equally important, but still very important, which is our institutions, universities or research institutions, need to get their act together. They are not administratively efficient in most places and don't look at the institution and its directions. They look upon themselves as post people who will take an individual investigator's problem and pass it on and pass on the response. So if there is a certain momentum in our institutional structure to take institutional responsibility, then this will also help that change. Why is this related to the question you asked? The initial condition when universities were there and research institutions were being started or new universities came up, had these kinds of structures proximal to each other. They worked very closely with each other. I don't have time now to go into that, but for example, the history of organic chemistry in the country is a very interesting one, looking at the university system, how closely it is tied to the National Chemical Laboratory, the Institute for Chemical Technology, IIT Kanpur, universities, Bombay University's department. They were close to each other. They went by again because of this administrative laziness in not attending to connectivity. Not just that there was a government plan to keep them separate and fund one and not the other. The drive and the push from the university sector to be at the forefront collapsed for a variety of reasons which we need to address now. Similarly, the research institutions, not seeing the universities as competition, became the best person in town. So you were top laboratory in house casts in the world, but those were your measures. Your measures were all local. Now this has to change, and I think a way by which we can change this, for example, in Hyderabad, there are about 40 central government research institutions and universities. If they came together and functioned seamlessly as one, if a student could go from any lab to any university and talk to anyone and have a guide and do any course, while preserving institutional autonomy, this would be transformative overnight. But getting these people to work together is a big challenge. Everyone, without exception, wants change as long as it doesn't happen. The moment you talk about your own institution and say, shall we do this? No, I know how to reform CSIR or ICAR, but for God's sake, don't try to reform me. That's going to be a tough one. So we really have to imbibe this idea that change is going to be difficult, whether it is within the government or outside. We need to explore new territory.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Raghavan. My next question is also to you. Time and again, we keep talking about how do we improve the ease of doing research in our country. Especially the position which you hold in Government of India. Would you like to give some, top of the line 3-4 suggestions? What do we need to do? Because you have been a practitioner yourself at the lab level as well as now at a policy level. So what do we need to do? I'm sure some baby steps have been taken. It's not that those are not getting taken. But what radical changes we could bring in if we were to give a, our research ecosystem has to take a quantum leap in near future, Dr. Raghavan?
Okay, so there are some things which are good in our structures, let's not refer to that. But the parts we need to change is the way our research agencies function internally. They need to be more cohesive and have a comprehension of what's happening rather than competence on every single project, which is running in its own way. There's strong attempts to change that, and I hope that happens. One striking example of, there are many examples, I should say few examples of things working well. Those examples should be learned from and improved on. The India Alliance is one in biology, but similar kinds of structures in engineering and mathematics would be very valuable. Some institutions do much better, and we should learn from them. What can we learn from those institutions? And those institutions which can navigate the complexity of our ease or difficulties in doing science have leadership which is paying attention to this and constantly giving feedback. It is a pain, and that's the way life is. Thermodynamically, entropy will take over unless you fight it back. And both the institutional feedback in addition to individual feedback is important. Otherwise, if there's no feedback to government drifts into processes which don't match with the culture of what we need. And so for this interaction is very important, and it must come from below too. It can't just come from a group of people saying this needs to be fixed. It's then a painful job saying, okay, how does it need to be fixed? Can 6 of us get together, talk to a specific person or persons dealing with this problem, sort it out? It'll be sorted out 80%. 3 months later, it'll slip back 20%. Then you have to go back and do this. So it's an endless job. So my feeling is that scientists in the country, until we are much more mature and a bigger science power, need to do 2 things. One, make sure that, like Manu talked about in China, that science spreads, whatever the budget we have, it spreads across the country. That ease of doing science is something we constantly address. And the third thing, related to the first point on spread, is have meetings and workshops in every single area for our universities and colleges. They need to be exposed to research and drive that. And whether it's government money or some other money, we need to raise that. The total number of, I did a calculation a few days ago, the total number of meetings and workshops in the marine biological laboratories and Cold Spring Harbor related only to biology is more than the total number of workshops across all sectors in the country. Now, this is a bit of a problem. This is a problem which we need to fix bottom up. And we can find resources, make a virtue of the internet requirements which we sadly face today, but still connecting science to a broader set of people in some way, quality side. By the way, this meeting which we are in right now has got an extraordinary set of speakers. I was looking through the speakers. That's the kind of breadth and depth in every topic which a kid in a college needs to also have accessible afterwards in YouTube with a translation in their language. And then, a mentor urging them to look at that. So these kinds of things are tough. They're not easy to do. They're easy to say, but the ease of doing interactions and all of this can change things quite well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Raghavan. Some very useful suggestions. And yes, much of what happens in ISF will be there on YouTube. And and thank you, thanks to your office. This time we have also engaged with the scientist community in the government labs and institutions. And some of them, based on their interests, hopefully the next 2 weeks, they would also attend some of the sessions, because there's some very, very good iconic speakers from all over the world. Thank you. So now I come to my last question, and that will be some kind of a very, very quick, very, very bullet points kind of answers what I said in the beginning from each one of you. Let me start with Dr. Jyotsna Dhawan, and I'll come to Dr. Raghavan here at the end. So what are your top 2 definitely? And if you really want to have a third one, top 3 ideas, how could we reform STEM, both from an education, either from an education or from a research career perspective in the country? some very actionable, very doable ideas, some of them Dr. Bhagwan gave, a lot of you gave, and also, for example, why we don't have a serious community of, or even a category for postdoc students, barring a few exceptions here and there, or, what she called as, the lab scientists, staff scientists, so these kind of things. So, Jyotsna, over to you.
So,
very short. My request is, because we want to.
I'm going to be very short, and I'm going to say the ideas are all out there. Okay, there's no dearth of ideas. Everyone is talking about these ideas, and they're all doable. But we need a change of attitude to really getting them done. And part of that is something that Vijay discussed, which was changes in institutional culture, right? Where leaders within institutes take feedback and actually draw upon people within their own community to actually spread these ideas and do it with some energy without making formulas of all of these things and simply ticking boxes because your funding agency is asking you for them. I think it needs engagement from all of us. One simple thing, within all our elite research institutes, we still have two cultures. We talk about outreach, and we're going to run down the road and talk to, some school or college that's out there. How many of us actually have programs for our non-scientific staff, for our administrative staff, for our housekeeping staff? We are not egalitarian instinctively, so we need to change that. So I think it's a matter of attitude.
Thank you. Yes, culture, attitude, these are big showstoppers, no doubt, but, I think I really liked what you talked about, establish a feedback mechanism. That was very, very important, if things have to change. So over to you, Karishma, the top 2-3 ideas, what we need to reform.
I'll tell you what my wish list is, and it is a wish. Of course, there are many things that will go into making it successful, but I would say that we early career scientists, at least we can, let the ball start with us. Let us bell the cat. We stop thinking of it as a project, a publication, a manuscript, and we actually start thinking of how are we contributing to the science ecosystem in India. I think I would, and of course, this will be met with a lot of pushback, saying, but I need my job, I need my grant, I need to pay my bills. But nevertheless, let's broaden our thought towards contributing to science in India. I think that would be my wish.
All right. So how, there should be some mechanism to, to facilitate that, how the young scientists contribute to building the right kind of science ecosystem.
Sure. And there are many ways. I can give a few easy examples. Maybe an internship with a student from a local college. That could be one way to start. Maybe starting an outreach arm for your research group. Maybe just communicating your published science in a platform like India Bioscience that more people can read. So just let's take the next step. Let's think of the next step and take it.
Thank you. Thank you, Karishma. Manu, over to you.
All right. If it's a wish list, I can go on for a very long time. But I'll try to keep it short. Everything that has been mentioned, or that I actually wanted to do, or wanted to say rather, has mostly been mentioned. But to Karishma's point, I definitely agree, right? It definitely has to start with us in terms of, if we want to sort of do the outreach, then we have to be the ones doing the outreach, right? And then simple mechanisms, right? Write a blog post, get together with 5 other people and do a online summer school, right? And just sort of try and engage kids, try and engage students from tier 2, tier 3 colleges who might sort of just get interested. And this is something that we've been trying for the past 5 years or so. And then these are relatively easy to do, especially given the COVID times and given the online modes of engagement. It just needs a few people to sort of come together, which essentially again boils down to early career researchers kind of, at least in their head, start rethinking what the incentive mechanisms are. And that kind of ties in to some extent towards institutional incentive mechanisms as well, right? As academics, our career progression is kind of dependent on how many papers we publish, how many grants we get, how many PhD students we graduate, so on and so forth. There is no incentive mechanism that is built in by the institution. So some by the funding agencies, but not really, where, we are incentivized for doing that summer school, going out to the nearby school and giving a talk, right? Or going by to the nearest degree college and trying to engage with the students. There's no incentive mechanism for that, and that needs to sort of change, right? I mean, everything being said and done, we are humans. We are driven by incentive mechanisms, and being an academic is also a job. So we need to sort of align the incentive mechanisms along those lines. And just very quickly, since this is a wish list and it's not very actionable, but I think a lot of the problems that sort of are there in the system, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of paperwork, all of that is because we have somehow built in a large amount of trust deficit at all levels, right? The funding agencies don't trust the PIs don't trust the institution doesn't trust the academics, so on and so forth, right? And again, I don't know where to get started for kind of removing that, but that is, sort of like a meta goal that I sort of see being achieved in, I don't know, in my career, let's say, and I'll be optimistic about that.
Thank you, Manu. I mean, just to quickly reiterate, we were having a long chat with Dr. Sanjay Sharma of MIT, and he said even in the US, a very large percentage of research that actually happens is not a very productive research. Much of it is research for research's sake. So, when I was trying to learn something for their experiences, which would be applied here in India, that's what he said. And in fact, the percentage that he attached to it, he said it's not to be quoted, but it's very, very high. So thank you. Over to Dr. Gagandeep Kang.
Thank you. So I will disagree with Jyotsna in that I think measurement and metrics matter. And at least initially, that people will tick boxes because the boxes are there to be ticked. But over time, change does happen by setting goals. So if you look, for example, at the Welcomes policy on public communication of science, it does make a difference when you have to fill out an entire long session about how you're going to do this. And I can tell you that with my PhD students, the ones who are registered with the Sri Chitra Institute for Science and Technology, they are required to go to schools and give a talk about their thesis topic. And most of them come back very excited about the interactions that they've had with school students. So sometimes metrics do matter, and we need to think sensibly about those. The other thing to think about is mentorship. We don't teach mentorship. We don't have formal programs for mentorship. And I think those are important. You need to create a structure. Most people don't even understand what being a mentor really means, the responsibilities that you have to take on. And if you are to maintain an environment that nurtures the next generation of scientists, I think it's critical. The third and last area, I think, is in our online world, we really need media training. When I was doing these pieces on misinformation, I'm physically very awkward. I can't sing or dance for nuts. But these people kind of walked you through, they looked at you and then they said, okay, we can put in these, I don't know, all kinds of stuff into the video so that it looks better and we hide how awkward you are. So I think it does make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Kang. I agree. So many years with the tech industry, I have also learned that something that you can't measure, you can't manage, leave aside, monitor it. So I think metrics do become important. Yes, sometimes people abuse metrics and data is put for the sake of it. But over a period of time, you can't endlessly keep on abusing the system. The classic example is ease of doing business. I mean, since the measurement started, a lot of effort started. Some critics may say that, oh, not much has changed. But if you talk to the business community, not that all problems have been sorted, but there has been some improvement. And our rank on ease of doing business has improved as a country to 100 plus something to 63rd. And last year it didn't happen because of COVID. I'm sure it could have improved further. So thank you. So last but not the least, Dr. Vijay Raghavan, over to you. Of course, during your earlier answers, you did mention a few tangible things, but in fact, several tangible things. But would you like to take this opportunity to suggest, some key reforms in the STEM education, as well as, from a career perspective, the entire landscape to improve and change?
Thank you. I won't reiterate much of what's been said or any of what's been said, much of which I agree with. What I'll try and point out is a fundamental problem facing science and technology all over the world, which is the conflation of precision with accuracy. And the idea, therefore, that, I've published so many papers, done this much outreach, done that, stood on a pen, rode a horse, now promote me. And this is, turning upside down the importance of measurement. We need to see those as outcomes of the work we do, not as the goals of what we need to do. Now, that has resulted, whether it is in funding agencies or institutions or scientists all over the world, trying every which way to game the system, to get more resources, increase rankings, have more distinguished faculty, and so on. It's gone berserk all over the world. We need to recalibrate, and we need to recalibrate in our context, because the problems we face today with reference to climate change, biodiversity, the environment, sustainable development, require basic fundamental research and application across the spectrum in our context to be driven. And therefore, we must reevaluate these metrics in substantial ways. That's number one. Second point, generally, in anything we do, whether it is our interaction with our institutional heads or funding agencies or with our students and so on, you can outline parameters A, B, C, D, which are needed to get done to get the outcome done. A small inefficiency in each of them results in the final product being, abysmally low in efficiency coming out. This is the way in linear paths, small inefficiencies multiply. So you need something which is called a forcing function to reset the steps which are not going. And these are external advice which you need to get and say, look, this is not the way it can be done. It needs to be fixed. So both those kinds of forcing functions, when things are not going well, whatever our interactions are, science or our administration, they need to be there as much as feedback loops of various kinds. So that's absolutely critically important. I'd like to end by saying that, these are all very tough things to do. It's not easy to, look at them and solve them, but we must move away from individuals being measured to institutions being measured. Institutions must have the room to decide, here are 5 people amongst my faculty who I know are not going to pay off in the next 5 years. They're going to pay off 10, 15 years from now. I will not apply these metrics to them. I will still promote that. That institutional courage and leadership, if that's not there, no amount of processes and rules and regulations will fix it. But the institutions at the same time must be measured very strongly on what its outcome is. If you are the National Institute of Immunology, what have you contributed to immunology? It doesn't matter whether you got 7 people who are theoretical physicists inside. Don't regulate them at that level, but make sure that they are the National Institute of Immunology. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. I think it's very, very important what you said, that measurements need to exist more at the institutional level rather than the individual level, and how aligned they are to solve the bigger challenges of the nation. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. We'll take a few questions. Some of the questions that I can straight away read is that how important it is to change, to bring changes in the way our institutions are managed. There seem to be some cracks in the way leaders are picked up or groomed. Of course, how they are managed, Dr. Raghavan did mention that in one of his answers, during the panel discussion. But he said, this question says that some cracks are there in the way the leaders are picked up and groomed. So this is not for any particular panelist, but anybody can answer that.
Which results in strong silence from everybody.
Okay. So azithromycin, what strength?
Well, I think I can certainly speak for the fact that I'm at a university system. Maybe can I take the stage?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I'm sticking my neck out here because this is a question nobody was ready to answer. But well, I mean, certainly, I completely agree. As long as you are promoting and giving leadership positions based on date of joining, which is absurd, absolutely absurd. I'm sorry, as early career researchers, we simply can't reconcile ourselves to this, where somebody is just being, going up the track based on when they joined and no other parameter. Unfortunately, even predatory journals now have been given some value. So definitely, at least in the university systems, there's a complete rehaul required. So how and where to start, it's like we're running around in circles sometimes, but that there is a rehaul needed beyond our institutes of eminence and other research institutes, absolutely, when it comes to building a leadership pyramid. Yes.
All right. Thank you. The next question I have is something very tangible somebody has asked. Does providing higher scholarship with terms, with a fixed term to work in India, let's say for next 5 years or so after their PhD or postdoc, a better idea to retain the scholar in the country? Anybody would like to volunteer?
I can answer. I can attempt to answer that.
Sure, Jyotsna.
I've just recently moved to the India Alliance, which one of the major programs of the India Alliance is just that. And that is identifying early career researchers who have, just finished their PhD so that you give them strong support and have them work within India. Now, I think those are wonderful programs and we are not doing enough of it, and we need to multiply those kinds of programs. Some institutes have actually taken this upon themselves to identify excellent PhD students and support them on a path to independence, which I think is very important. For example, the National Center for Biological Sciences does this with a strong career fellowship improvement program for early career fellows. But, I don't think it's actually such a terrible thing to have a person go anywhere else in the world to do a postdoc and come back. I think it's actually important because there are learnings that you have not just from your exposure to science in a wonderful lab, which may be here or anywhere on the globe, but there are also cultural learnings. And I think that those actually leaven our environment. So I'm not too worried about people going anywhere in the world for a postdoc, so long as we have good programs back here to be able to attract people and to enable them once they come back. And also that we don't create a situation where our institutes feel that the stamp of a postdoc from outside the country is a requirement for career progression. So I think that too has to change. But these things are starting to change, but not nearly enough.
Yeah, thank you, Jyotsna. The next question I have is, the quality of faculty and teachers is perhaps pivotal to generate quality students. How do we ensure that the best talent comes to teaching profession and enable them grow continuously? Learning is a lifelong exercise which doesn't seem to apply to the teaching community in the country. So, what we, and again, a larger question, what we as a country are doing to attract the best-in-class people to opt for a career in academics. This question, of course, somebody may say that this applies to the education sector and less to science and technology. But given his wide experience, may I take the liberty of posing this to Dr. Raghavan? Yeah.
Oh dear. I also noticed your next speaker who's speaking on a slightly more emergency topic is already with us. So I guess we should finish fast.
Yeah. So by 3 minutes, we'll wind up shortly. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the question, Jayant? Sorry.
So this was that the quality of faculty.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
So when the IISERs were expanded and then the IITs were expanded, this was a refrain that we shouldn't do those because we won't get quality faculty members. Now, part of this has validity, are the aims, for example, right? Where will we get our directors of quality faculty members and so on? Part of this is valid because the sudden boom was not expected and we didn't see this as an opportunity and train people. Part of this is also a bit of elitism, that, good faculty members are people like us, and unless we train them over a 100-year period, we're not going to populate these institutes with good teachers. That's rubbish. There are many, many kinds of good faculty members, and there is a significant fraction of them who will do really well when thrown at the deep end of the pool. Next point, which Gagandeep mentioned, we have a significant fraction of young people, not just to go to elite institutions. People are driven by the thirst for and the excitement of science and for getting a job. The first is not absent. And these people love to learn. It's just amazing. You go to, our metros, you see little fire in the belly. You go to a small town, it's just incredible, whether it is science, skilling, engineering, whatever, the desire of people to be pointed in the right direction and do stuff. So many of our teachers and faculty members need just to be like, monks sitting on top of the hill and just not say too much. That'll help a lot, and just point in some random direction and the kids will do great. And of course, there are others who are really valuable as teachers.
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. And I take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for your wonderful inputs at this very important panel discussion, because, doing up the entire platform for STEM education and careers is fundamental to improving science and technology in India, the landscape in India. And I won't even attempt to summarize, because the gamut of discussion has been so wide and such interesting inputs. We have the recording available. We'll consolidate that and share, the final list of ideas that emerged. Not just the minutes of the meeting kind of a thing, but some of the ideas that emerged during this last 1 hour and 15 minutes. And thank you so much for being with us. We really value, an organization like FAST can only succeed, if we have such value-added discussions with very, very eminent people like you, who collectively create a science and technology ecosystem in the country. Thank you so much. This inaugural panel discussion of the India Science Festival has gone off very well. And may I request each one of you and your respective scientist community in your organizations, or the academic community in your organizations, to join this depending upon their areas of interest. Thank you so much. We really value your very, very important and value-added inputs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Have a great evening.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for joining in. It was an absolute pleasure listening to this conversation. And on behalf of the entire team, we're very, very grateful to all of you for taking out the time and engaging with us. A big thanks to Mr. Jayan Krishna, the CEO of FAST India, for beautifully moderating the conversation. And with that, we move on to the next bit. Now, I'm very, very excited to introduce the next speaker, and who's been associated with ISF for the past few months and has been very, very gracious in engaging with us. Professor Stewart, if I could request you to kindly turn on your camera. It's an absolute pleasure to host you here. And he's joining us all the way from Jordan. And let me just give a very quick introduction. Professor Ian Stewart is the Al Hassan bin Talal Research Chair in Sustainability at the Royal Scientific Society in Jordan. He is also the co-director for the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability, which is the 3CS Institute at Ashoka University. And he is also the professor of geoscience communications at the University of Plymouth. He is very well known for his work in geoscience and science communication, and has been associated with the BBC in multiple programs, some of which are How Earth Made Us, How to Grow a Planet, Earth, the Climate Wars, and so on. Professor Stewart was also involved in our Science Communication Conclave, where he gave us an overview of SciComm practices in the UK. And it's such a pleasure to host you at the festival once again, Professor Stewart. Thank you for joining us. And he's going to be talking to us about the history of climate change in line with our fantastic theme continuum. And Professor Stewart, now I'll just hand over the dais to you. If you could just check if your screen share is working, we'll take it ahead from there. I'd request all of our attendees to drop in their questions in the Q&A tab, and Professor Stewart will take it towards the end of his talk. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shruti. And I really enjoyed that last discussion, actually. And it kind of feeds into the one that I'm going to talk about, because it's really about what the fundamental purpose of science communication is. So let me just share screen and make sure we're pulling this up. So perhaps someone can tell me if you should be seeing this more or less full size now. I'm seeing nods. So yeah, I've taken trying to talk about the history of climate change and climate science as a huge subject. So I thought that, given the context of the festival, that I should try and take it through from the perspective of communication and miscommunication, and it touches on many of the issues that the previous panel have talked about, which is the role of the scientist expert in universities, which have largely been focused on kind of producing scientific knowledge and kind of sending it out there. And now the challenges of a public and politicians and things like that, they suddenly need information from scientists, and how we adjust to that. So that's a thread that sits beneath my talk. I'm going to call it the climate wars, and you'll see why in a minute, because what we're really looking at here is essentially a battleground of information that's coming from all sides about this. And this happens to be about climate change, but it could be pandemics, it could be anything of real critical contested interest to science and to the public. So I'm based now at the Royal Scientific Society in Jordan. I'm a research chair in sustainability there, but I'm also a professor of geoscience communication at the University of Plymouth in the UK. And I have this role as co-director of the 3CS Climate Change Sustainability Research Centre at Ashoka University. And in each of those areas, the key thing is really about how do we communicate technical, complex science to non-technical audiences. And that could be media, that could be communities, that could be politicians. So anyway. Oh. Sorry, what's happened? So can you hear me okay? Can you still see me?
Yeah.
Perfect, sorry. So, about over 10 years ago, I made a documentary for BBC Science called Climate Wars. It was the history of climate science, and in many respects, that was over kind of 3 hours of television, really tracking it from the 50s and 60s all the way through to the kind of present day and the emergence of a kind of modern understanding, collective understanding of science. So if you're interested, you can go and check that out on YouTube and things like that. But I just want to draw attention to a few key points that emerges from that. Now, let me just give you a little clip, a few minutes of, you get a sense of this here. So hopefully this will work. And actually, I wonder if I should, if you don't hear the sound properly, I can share this better, but let's see if this goes.
All of that structure. Global warming is not a crisis. I think this conference proved that there's no consensus.
CO2 is in no way connected to global warming. Yeah. It never has driven temperature. It never will.
School children across the world are being scared to death based on speculative, unproven computer models, and a lot of people, including the media, should be ashamed of themselves.
Some of the scientists here have spent years questioning catastrophic global warming, like climatologist Pat Michaels.
You seem to really thrive on the energy of the debate of this.
Well, sure. I kind of picked this was going to happen somewhere around 1972, which I date myself. So Woody Allen.
Have you lost friends over this, for example, or has it got to that level?
No, I don't think anybody should go into science to make friends.
The carbon dioxide is not a pollutant.
Are you saying that we're now at a climate halt? I do not know of a single scientist who accepts the fact that there's been any increase due to global warming.
Some see these people as heroes, as modern day Galileos speaking out against oppressive orthodoxy. Others compare them to Holocaust deniers. That is one hell of a difference of opinion.
So one of the key things really that particular program was looking at was where the science starts to get contested. Now this graph here, you probably are aware of if you've looked at any climate change. This is what's called the Keeling curve. This is the record of the measured record of carbon dioxide on the planet as measured from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And what we see is it starts the late 1950s. And even from the start, you see the rise and fall, which is the annual breathing of the planet between the northern and southern hemispheres. And then what you see is you see a rising incline of carbon dioxide levels. And what's interesting is we've had that record for all this time. And it always surprises people of when it is that the first time President of the United States talks about climate change as a key issue, the burning of fossil fuels as affecting climate change. And I'll make your own, you can make your own decide about where you think that is going to be, but the answer is 1965. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson says, this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Now, I was born in 64, so that means for my entire life, we have understood at the highest political level that the burning of fossil fuels drives climate change. And yet, why is it that we are now essentially, 50, 60 years further on, and we're still having debates in many areas, particularly parts of the world, about the role of this? What we see is that when we get to the 1980s, there is a number of reports under the President Carter's line, that talk about trying to model the climate change and improve the science. A report in 1978 by the so-called Jason Committee, and then a report in 79 by the Charney report. These are all expert science panels that basically talk about that, the carbon dioxide increases is driving climate change in a significant way. The big change that happens is in 1980 when Ronald Reagan comes in, and Ronald Reagan brings on a guy called Bill Nierenberg, and Bill Nierenberg is the head of Scripps Oceanography Institute in San Diego, very, very well-respected climate scientist himself, and indeed the person who had basically supported Dave Keeling in getting his measurements of the CO2 off and running and continuing. And he was put in charge of a project, of a report that brought the climate scientists together, but interestingly enough, also brought together some economists. And it was the economists that framed the climate science as, yes, it's happening, we accept it, it's real, but framed it in a slightly different way. One of the ways was, hey, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe this carbon dioxide is good for plants, isn't it? So maybe it will actually help us increase the wheat fields of the earth. Maybe we can feed more people as a result of this warming climate. That was one angle. A different angle was the role of, well, actually, maybe this is bad, but maybe this is just what humans need. This is our moonshot. This is our fundamental challenge. It's going to have scientists rising up and with human ingenuity getting through this. And so on the back of that, then, really two different approaches spun out of that. An approach that followed science and was characterized by the start of late 1980s of the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a global kind of association, collective of scientists, climate experts that publish on climate science, write review reports, which then get fed through the political system, have a transparent review process whereby anyone can sign up to be a reviewer and can evaluate it and produce reports that are signed off by governments and signed up to by governments. But then there's another thing. There's an alternative, a non-governmental international panel on climate change. This was created by a group of skeptics, of people who were contrarians, arguing against the science, led by a guy who you saw in the video there called Fred Singer, who was the head of the American, at one point, the American Meteorological Society. So he was a weatherman, if you like, a meteorologist. And indeed, several of the people you see listed there are meteorologists. But many of them are not, and many of them have got no particular association with climate or with meteorology. And indeed some, and there's a particular one, Richard Courtney in the bottom on the left there, who is editor of Coal International, or was at that time. And other people, a guy called Christopher Monckton from the UK, is a very prominent skeptic with absolutely no scientific or environmental credentials at all. In fact, if you look at that whole list, none of those people have published on climate change, climate science. So one of the interesting things I think is, for me, was the contrarians who were scientists, who were meteorologists. This Fred Singer here, Pat Michaels, you saw in that video, and Richard Lindzen at MIT, there are very prominent people who were arguing that this new thing of climate science was really contrary to the fundamentals of meteorology, of the weather forecasting. I think what that reflects is a kind of battleground between two sciences, the established science of meteorology, where the complexity of the short-term weather and the long-term averaging out of climate that the climate scientists were developing. And with that in mind, I love this little video. I'm just going to show this video, but it tries to set out the differences. Let me show you this.
Well, whatever happened to global warming, eh? Stop. From October the 1st, if you say whatever happened to global warming, eh? Whenever it's a bit cold or wet, you could be cooling off in a prison cell. This leaflet is being sent to every household in Britain. You have until September the 30th to learn the difference between climate, a long-term trend averaged over many years, and weather, which is what's going on outside the window right now. Make sure you study it, because if you don't, the next shower you get caught in could be in the prison wash block.
Look at this weather, eh? Still, I'm sure it will average out statistically to indicate a long-term warming trend.
Global warming quips. Get acclimatized.
So that illustrates a rather humorous approach to this fundamental difference between weather and climate, which confuses the public and indeed in some cases confuses the politicians. Ooh. So the other area of great contrarians that has happened and held climate science back is actually the geologists. And I'm a geologist, and geologists have been very particularly important part of the push up against climate change policy, climate action. And this one's characterized by this guy called Ian Plimer, who's one of the leading geologists, Australian geologists and economic geologists. So he works on mineral resource exploitation, extraction. And his point is, if we can't understand the climate changes of the past, and climate has changed very dramatically in the past, then we can't hope to understand the changes that are happening right now. So it's kind of playing on the unfamiliarity of the past geological changes of mountains building and oceans opening and closing and huge volcanic eruptions and all the rest of it, to say, look, actually, we've got no idea really, what's happening with this. So that becomes an important area. But actually, one of the most compelling aspects now of the climate science debate really is the geoscience and the geological record. And this is an extraordinary graph, really. This is the measurement of the CO2 concentrations from ice cores from the Antarctic largely. The record goes back almost 1 million years, 800,000 years. And what we see is the ups and downs of the ice age cycles in and out of ice age between about 180 parts per million when we're in an ice age and 280 parts per million when we're out of one in a so-called interglacial period. And we see the planet bouncing between these 180 and 280 for about the last million years over the course of hominid and human evolution, really. Modern humans arrive about 200,000 years ago. And we see that as we come out the last ice age, a fundamental difference it gets to about 1900. And instead of it going back down again, it goes on and on and on and on, jumping by about another 150 parts per million. So way more than what has been bounced around between in and out of the ice ages. And that is the human legacy. So what I want to just focus on in this last little bit then is why is it that people are uncertain about this? Is it indeed about these contrarians that are confusing the issues and blurring the science, or is it something else? And there's certainly an element of manufactured uncertainty. There's a really nice film by Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt, and she's got a book on this, where she highlights the role of the tobacco industry and the big pharma industry kind of approaches of seeding doubt. You see the quote there, seeding doubt is the best means of competing with the body of fact. It's much easier to just make people think, well, maybe it's not that, and then a whole bunch of things can take over. So doubt, creating doubt is an important part. And indeed, it's a very simple thing to do, to the so-called idea of junk science. We see it in pandemics, we see it in other things as well. But in terms of climate change, there's 3 steps. Number one, argue that cause and effect have not been established in any way. So again, this goes back to the tobacco industry fighting against regulation and big pharma as well. Say there's no clear indication that this particular thing causes this particular effect. Then statisticians and baselines come up and find it has. And then they say, well, statistics can't prove anything. You know, that's not the answer. But of course, the statistics over time get better and better and better. And eventually what the beautiful third one is to say more research is needed. Let's give these scientists more money, more research, so they can prove absolutely that this is the case. And of course, that misses a fundamental understanding of what science is about. It's not about proving anything. If it's anything, it's about disproving, but it's about always asking and always questioning. And so politicians have used this then. This was Frank Luntz, George Bush's one of Republican advisors, really, in 2003, arguing to the Republican Party that the way you do this is that you highlight scientific uncertainty. And as soon as you highlight scientific uncertainty, people feel easier to just reject the science because it's too complicated for them to understand. But I would argue that that is a relatively small part of the way that the reason that people aren't necessarily conforming to the way the scientists think about these things, the vast majority of the scientists. Because what we see, this is our famous plot showing the so-called 6 Americas, how the public see climate change. And there's basically 6 different publics there based on their values, the way they see things, their political views, their environmental views. So there's a small amount that are alarmed on one side, and there's a small amount that are dismissive on the other side, and then there's groups in the middle that are different levels of confusion around this. And so the point here is that, you know, it's how we get our information out that's actually going to be to these different publics that's critical. And I think scientists here have been really lazy in the way that they've done it. They write their reports, they publish it, they put it out there, and they don't think about trying to reach different audiences. And one of the reasons for that in climate change is because it's just so complicated. You know, this is actually a quote from a climate skeptic, but I think it's absolutely right. You know, global warming is a complicated, you know, topic, sprawls in 1,000 directions. There's no one really that's an expert on all aspects of it. But what this quote opens up the opportunity for is basically to say, well, if no one is an expert on it, then anyone can have a view on it. And of course, that's not necessarily the same thing. So other aspects is politics. This is from the US, but you know, the way that people see environmental issues and the way they see particularly global heating, climate change is very much dominated by their politics. So Liberal Democrats, for example, largely 80 to 95% supporting idea that they're very worried or somewhat worried by climate change. And right down at the bottom, 14% are the conservative Republicans. So, you know, and that's something that goes all the way through science, all the way through graduates in university, etc. And it's an important filter. Interestingly enough, what the previous one that I showed with the 6 Americas was based in 2010, 2011. This is what it is now. And so now we have a relatively, a much bigger, about 1/3 of the population in the US being alarmed about climate change, and in 26 being concerned. So that's over 50%, the majority in those 2 categories. And we still have a residual 10% that are dismissing it as a load of rubbish. But I think what we're seeing there is that a gradual coming together of a consensus among the public that actually, you know what, this is happening. And I wonder, it's interesting, what has done that? The science hasn't changed since 1965, more or less, What has changed? And I think one thing that's changed is a much wider collective of public that's actually engaging in the climate debate. So the top left images of the Paris Climate Agreement, where the politicians of all the Christiana Figueres and colleagues that pushed through the Paris Climate Agreement. So, but also supporting that were religious leaders. So we see Pope John Paul, who wrote his encyclical about climate change. In the bottom right, we have Elon Musk. We have business leaders talking about climate change affecting the business bottom line. And we have people like Leonardo DiCaprio, celebrities, media influencers that are talking about it. So really the difference is that these kind of groups have picked up the science and are taking it to those different groups, those different demographics, in a way that scientists never really did. And so now what we see is, I think the influencers in the climate debate are these kind of people here. Top left, local people. This is an Inuit hunter in Greenland. Local people who are actually experiencing climate change. Top right, David Attenborough, so media producers and media content that are trusted and are now starting to report and be connected. Greta, of course, movements, social movements like the Future for Fridays for the Future, that's basically catalyzing a whole new demographic. And then street movements, protest movements of climate extinction coming through there. And so one of the interesting questions then for me is, given that these different groups are carrying forward the science, what is the role of scientists? What should we be doing at this time? Should we still be just doing our reports, or do we need to start getting much more involved in the advocacy and indeed the activism of our times? And that really relates back to some of that previous discussion we had about what universities and academic scientific institutions are for in these critical times. So I just want to finish with this slide, because here we have Christiana Figueres in the left-hand side there, and she's saying, this is a quote from earlier this year, just before COP, we're entering the most critical decade of human existence. By the end of the 2020s, we will have largely decided the quality of life on this planet for centuries to come. There has never been a more urgent need for the superpower of media companies. The time to use it is now. And then David Attenborough is talking about saving the planet is now a communication challenge. We know what to do. We just need the will. And so the point here really is that we now, as an academic scientific community, we need to really think about what our role is about communicating and how do we help bring the science to people in a way that is actually meaningful and moves the dial. So on that point, I'll stop sharing and open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor. That was absolutely delightful to hear. And we're really buzzing. The Q&A tab is buzzing with questions, and so is our social media. And we've collected a couple of questions from here and there, and had also invited some questions beforehand. So with that, I'll get started into the Q&A section of this session. So the first question that we have for you is, what can young people, particularly those invested in STEM, do about climate change? What would your call to action be for them?
I think this has been one of the fundamental changes really in the last few years. A few years ago, the climate scientists that I talked to were thoroughly depressed. I mean, arguably, this was partly in relation to Donald Trump becoming president and taking the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And there was a real sense that nothing was, if the US weren't going to engage, then nothing was going to happen. But the thing that has galvanized those same people to be much more positive now is the youth movement, is Greta and this social movement. So basically what's happened is that we've created this big push, this force for change that is now pushing not just governments, universities as well. At universities, we're having to change our courses because into our universities are coming a set of people that say, we don't want to just hear about the science of the past. We want to know what we do about it. This is our future. You need to train us for this new future that's coming, not the future that you had, because really the last few years has changed all the rules, really. So I think that the youth movement is a fundamental force for change that's happening. And the main thing to do is to talk about it, is to be talking about climate change, to be normalizing the fact that climate change is real, it's happening. That's not the question. The question is, what are we going to do about it? For most people, the solutions are there. It's a case of the will to impose those solutions. And that is something that the politicians will only adapt to when they see the public is behind that.
So much. We have another question here that talks about geoscience communications. So we know that you've actively been involved in science communication, but particularly in geosciences communication, and you've been involved with the media for this. So is there any specific route to be taking towards geosciences communication? Why is it such a specialized field, and why has it sort of evolved and how has it evolved in the past few years?
It's an interesting question, because science, in many aspects, the aspects of geoscience communication are exactly the same as science communication in relation to biology or physics or chemistry or whatever. But there are differences, and up until recently, science communication courses and thinking has been dominated by the big three: biology and chemistry and physics. And yet the irony is that the popular media world hasn't reflected those big three. The kind of science that works best in television, certainly in the European area, is physics, but cosmology, the planets up there, not bench physics, not normal lasers and things like that, but actually where have we come from, those fundamental questions about cosmology. And then geology, lots of programs about geology, geoscience, volcanoes and earthquakes and dinosaurs and things like that. And then archaeology as well. And these are the historical sciences. These are the sciences that tell the fundamental human story of where we've come from. So I think that geoscience is an easier thing to communicate to people than straight physics, straight chemistry, straight biology. In fact, actually, chemistry is completely missing from the kind of popular media world. It's a very difficult thing to connect. But geoscience is great because in a way it's kind of simple. You stand there by a waterfall, and it's a waterfall. You stand there by a volcano. You stand there by a rock. We say, see how this rock, this stone, it looks like it's made of sand. We call it a sandstone. This is not difficult stuff. So people can relate to geology. The bit that's harder is their unfamiliarity of why they should even care about it. So I think but then again, this is where geoscience comes to the rescue, because we've got 4.5 billion years of amazing stories of continents moving, oceans disappearing, the most incredible things that's happening, the evolution of life, fossils, paleontology, we've got everything. So it's really a dream to be able to communicate. It's just fantastic to be able to communicate geoscience. So I would combine those two things. The fundamentals are pretty much the same, but the actual tools, the toolkit that we've got as geoscientists is probably better than any of the other sciences.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, in terms of just geology, something that you can see.
Yeah.
It's easier to communicate.
It is. And the window for many people is the landscape. They drive around a landscape and they're often thinking, why is that there? Why is that hill there or something? So, and again, that's the thing that, say, if you're trying to communicate nanotechnology or what's happening in the middle of a stem cell, that is hard. It's really tricky.
Absolutely. And I think that plays into very well with the next question that has been put in the Q&A tab. One of the students in our audience has said that what problems of climate change are associated with chemistry and have not been tapped very well in sciences? I mean, or in media. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, well, chemistry is the science of all the sciences that really brought climate change out. So it was people looking at the chemistry of the atmosphere and the chemistry of the oceans changing. Roger Revelle, who was the advisor to Al Gore when he was a doctoral student, way back in the 50s and 60s. It was that kind of work that really set the basis of the climate science that we have today. I think so there's some relating to continuing that work and understanding it a little bit more. But to be honest, I think we know it well enough to not be waiting for action. When we talk about action, another aspect of chemistry I think is going to be extremely important is how do we start to pull out the CO2 from the air, and if need be from the oceans, but particularly from the air. And so this idea of carbon sequestration, drawing it out of the air and storing it somewhere, is fundamental chemistry. So particularly the storage, if it's permanent storage inside the earth, you need to bring the CO2 down, you inject it under pressure as a kind of fluid by that point, and then hopefully you try and bind it in the subsurface with rocks and permanently isolate it. And that will demand huge intelligence around the chemical reactions for those kind of changes. So, chemists have a massive role to play in climate change.
Thank you. I think the example really helped too. So that was really great. The next question that we have here is that you've been working in various countries. I mean, we saw a clipping from the USA. You've been associated with the University of Plymouth for so many years. You're now working in Jordan and are also associated with the Ashoka University. How do you think, what the first part of the question is, what has your personal takeaway been in terms of the publics of these countries percepting and understanding and analyzing climate change and its effects and the future that climate change has on planet Earth? And the second thing is, what do you think are some major impacts that climate change has for a country like India? I mean, if you could shed some light in the Indian context, I think it will be very helpful for our audiences.
So taking the first one first, I think that one of the aspects of communication that's really critical is that we need to understand those local contexts, those local publics. So, science and the understanding of science is culturally different. So only some things, you can go around communicating science, but not all of the approaches will fit those different places. So one of the key things, it actually makes it easier, because one of the first things you need to do as a communicator is to listen, to understand the public that you've got in front of you. What is it they care about? What do they want to know? And once you know that, you know what to communicate. We often start the wrong way around. This is what I know, and I'm going to tell you, and then I might listen to what you've got to say back. So as you go from India and to Jordan or into the UK, the publics are interested in different things. So that's a critical bit. In terms of India, I guess the two, there's a whole bunch. I mean, India is one of the reasons why I'm so delighted to be working in India is that the range and diversity of the issues related to climate change and sustainability is so huge. Air pollution, an obvious one, and anyone in Delhi will understand that the effect of climate change, adding to the problems of biomass, agricultural burning, and just the general kind of microclimate of central India. But that is a huge problem in terms of loss of life, health effects for populations. Flooding and the uncertainties over the monsoon, the Indian monsoon. Will it be weakened as a result of climate change by the ocean increases in the ocean temperature, maybe reducing the balance between land temperature and ocean temperature, which is what a big driving force of the monsoon is? But other people argue, and some of the models argue, that it could be increasing, and that means flooding. That means large-scale seasonal flooding, switching with times that are of great aridity and potential drought, etc. And then on the political front, I mean, a huge political aspect is coal, and energy. We saw at COP, India setting out the red lines around, particularly around coal, and we know why. Access to energy for this huge population that needs to develop, but at the same time, coal being this terrible fossil fuel for the planet. So that is a really difficult balancing act that politicians with scientists, alongside, are going to have to try to resolve. So I think I'll keep it at those three. So.
Thank you so much. The next question that we have, we've got a lot of questions to cover in the next 10 minutes, but we'll just get cracking on them. Okay, so one question that we've been asked is that, can you name some achievements of countries that are signatories to the climate change conventions, and how are they actually implementing these how are these treaties being implemented in countries? I mean, there's so much debate that's been going on around all of these treaties, and to see if they're actually making a difference to the problem at hand. So do you have any, perhaps any positive instances?
Yeah, and I think we need positive stories. I have to say, it tends to be the smaller countries that have more options to do it. So yeah, actually, in terms of regulatory change, the UK and in particular Scotland, where I'm from, has been really out in front. But we can kind of do it because we're a small country. We've got 5 million. Scotland, for example, small country, 5 million people, lots of different energy options, for example. But yeah, we also have an oil industry offshore that we have to kind of wean ourselves off. So there are issues there. But that is, Scotland in particular in the UK has been very strong on pushing regulatory change. And other countries like Finland and some of the smaller countries, Scandinavian countries, doing the same. The one I would pick out was Costa Rica, and it's a famous example. Costa Rica is now almost 100% of its energy is renewable. I think it is 100%. Huge emphasis on increasing and bringing back forest reforestation and biodiversity, and focusing its tourism around biodiversity, ecotourism being a major aspect. But these are small countries. These don't give you the templates for a country like India or China to do it. India and China will have to find a different way through this. But I think, as I said, it is important to hang on to those really positive stories of transformative change that make people's lives better as a result of this kind of low carbon world that we're moving towards.
I think one of the major takeaways for my conversations with you is how aware you are of the role that culture and society plays in science, and you've actively been propagating the same. In terms of countries which are really have to deal with massive populations, a large area of land, and of course various problems that accompany, do you think there are some very specific measures that have been taken by big countries such as India or China, which have worked well, and which are good examples to follow?
Well, I think there is a real sense that high carbon fuels energy is on the way out. The argument is whether it's going to take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, etc. But for investors starting to think about big energy projects, in the short term, there may be a need to do this, but in the long term, fossil fuels are on their way out, certainly by the end of the century. And so big countries like China, for example, been this huge investor in renewable energy. Everyone points to the fact, they're bringing on, a coal-fired power station, but they're the biggest investor in renewables. The new technologies that's driving the electrification or electric vehicles, etc. Again, China leading the way on this. And it will be the galvanization, the catalyzation of the economic system that will move us into, the financial and business advantages of this new low carbon world will be the thing that carries us through. So I think that although for some people, they want to see the end of the current economic system, this capitalist system, this very consumptive system that's clearly taken us to the brink of collapse, I think that many of us still think that system tweaked to be directed more at well-being than at maximization than profit maximization, that well-being economy will be the way out. And the big countries will be able to shift their systems. And the developing countries are still developing their systems, so they can adjust to the well-being economy mode quicker than some of the existing the countries, developed industrial plants and industrial nations. So I think that there is a lot of good things, but I would definitely sit around the renewable energy aspect.
One question that we've often got from our attendees is this constant problem of climate change deniers and the misinformation that's being spread. And it's all come to light even more so in the pandemic, where there's been so much misinformation and fake news going about. Now, what have you, as a scientist and a geoscientist communicator, what are some tangible actions that you have taken in your approach while dealing with climate change deniers? Are there any tips and tricks that you would want to share with our audiences that you have taken and have worked in the past?
Yeah, initially, I mean, I've had to deal with climate contrarians, climate deniers for 20 years, really. And initially, what I did was mainly try to engage in dialogue with them, and sometimes that was useful, but you quickly realize that there's different reasons for people having contrarian views. Some of them are driven by their own philosophy, and it's usually a political or an economic mindset that doesn't, like low tax, liberalism, libertarianism or something. It's not really, you quickly see it's not really about the science. So explaining the science better doesn't help, because that's not why people are objecting to it. Where people actually have problems with the science, then you can have that kind of discussion. But in my view, most of the people that I encountered who were very, very strong on this weren't really interested in the science. I think this is what really shifted my thinking into trying to understand what people think and why they think it. The vast majority of people, as I tried to show in those plots, are in the messy middle. They're not fundamentally opposed, they're just confused. The science is hard, it's complicated, they know their lives are going to change, they're reluctant to change. So the science needs to be gradually and gently introduced to them and interact with them. So the most recent example, I guess, of this is I was communication lead and an evidence chair for the Scottish Climate Assembly. And that was over a period of 6 months. We took 100 normal people off the street, demographically representative of Scotland, so a mini Scotland, if you like. And over the course of 6-7 weekends, we sat them down and initially took them through about climate change and some of the implications for energy and food, etc., and gradually gave them more and more space to talk about the issues. And that's what they did. And at the end, they produce a report, write a report, having heard from lots of experts, which they then presented to the Scottish government. And 2 weeks ago, the Scottish government formally responded to that. And so their changes will be fed into government policy. And that was normal people that when they turned up on day one, most of them said, I have no idea what this is. And I'm not sure I care, you know. Some of them thought it was a load of rubbish. Some of them were environmentally aware and activists, but the majority of people weren't. But all of them became engaged because the science was put to them in a way that they could understand. They could interrogate the experts. Why do you think that? Tell me about this. What about this? Have discussions. And I think we call it kind of slow cooked politics, you know, slow deliberative processes is very effective. The problem is it takes time and resource. And often we're not willing to, as scientists, we're not willing to do it. We have to teach, we have to write a research papers, we have to get a research grants in. We can't spend 6 months just kind of holding the hands of a set of kind of publics. So I think we really need to sit down and think what's important. But I think that citizens' assembly model is a very effective one for lots of contested environmental aspects. And it could certainly run in India, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. I think what I really take back from what you just mentioned is really we need to take more efforts to understand why there is so much backlash against climate change and the science that goes behind it. Why is there a reason that people are actually denying climate change when they can actually see it? So I think that's such a good takeaway. There's one question that we have that we'll just take up, and then therefore we'll go on to the last bit of our session. So there's a statement here: a major global initiative in a consortium model on renewable energy similar to the Project Genome can reduce carbon footprint in a significant manner. Could you please comment?
Oh, I don't know about that one, but I think that what we're seeing is, I guess what I would say is there's lots and lots of projects that are coming out. I mean, there's such an exciting diversity of stuff happening. And, you know, it's great that there's a lot of this that's coming out. It's coming through. Some of it will be technology driven, some of it will relate to behavioral change and things like that. And this goes back to that notion right at the start when I was saying about climate change as being seen as this fundamental challenge to humanity to step up and be smarter, you know, use our ingenuity. So there's lots of these projects, but I would say that the basic point is that we already have the solutions to climate change. We know what they are. Most of them are tried and tested. But what the problem is implementing them. It's getting politicians to agree to bring this thing for this threat that is still seen as 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So technology is going to play, and science is going to play a role. But I think it's the role of scientists and technologists in influencing that implementation, of getting action. And that's where scientists need to work a lot closer with the public. So as I say, I can't comment on that specific program. It sounds great, sounds amazing. But I think that the problem isn't going to be solved by any individual single one. It's going to be by a collective shift in thinking and in mindsets.
So much, Professor. I honestly did not realize how 45 minutes just flew by. But with that, I think we've come to the end of the session. I'd just like to ask you one question that we ask all of our speakers, and we'd love to know your thoughts on the same. What do you think is the role of public engagement platforms such as India Science Festival in building bridges between science and society? And what role is a science communication platform such as this one what is the good thing that it's doing to actually bring science and society together?
I think the first thing that it does is it creates a platform of unity, of community. So, you know, science engagement, science communication can be quite a lonely business when you're out there. And it's good to know that there's a group of people like you that are interested and passionate about it, swap stories, swap approaches, etc. And that's very positive. The danger is that then becomes an echo chamber of a small group of people reaching it. So we know from the empirical studies that actually a lot of public outreach and science outreach, science communication reaches a very small portion of the population, and they're already interested in science and already aware of these issues. The trick is, how do you break through to those broader audiences that aren't interested in it and might not be turning up on the platform? So I think these kind of platforms need to evolve to be more and more reaching out and thinking of innovative, creative ways to break down the traditional public academia barriers. But you need to start with a community, and you need to start with a platform. So it's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was an absolute pleasure doing this Q&A with you, and I'm sure our attendees had a lovely time. We can have a look at all of the ISF recordings that go up on our YouTube channel. We'll be putting them up post the festival, and we're streaming all of our events live on YouTube, so you can check them out over there too. Professor Stewart, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be associated with you in the coming years too. And we would love to host you at a festival when it actually goes offline. Yeah. And we would love to host you in India for the same. But thank you for taking the time out, and it was absolutely lovely hosting you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for reaching out and giving me the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Professor.
Bye.
I'll just move on to the next session. I hope you all have had a nice time. It's 8 p.m. in India, and we've already covered the first two sessions of our very first day. It's been really lovely out here, and we're now moving on to the next bit of our sessions for the day one of our festival. Before we just move in, I'd just like to tell all of our attendees that we have a social media contest running on Twitter. If you like anything about this festival, if you have any comments to offer, please take a screen grab of whatever you see, put it up on Twitter, tag us on Twitter, and use the hashtag ISF 2022, and make sure that you tag us, and we'll the best get exciting prizes. So do participate in our social media contest. We'll also be reading, we'll also be dropping our ISF feedback form in the chat. So if you have any comments to offer, if you have any ideas on how we could improve our events for the future, please tell us, and we'll make sure to incorporate them. And with that, I would request the interviewer for the next session, Shantan Datta, to take over from here. Shantan is the science journalist who's going to be interviewing Angela Seni, and we're very, very excited for these two journalists to be in conversation with each other. With that, Shantan, take it ahead.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for passing it on, and a big welcome to you, Angela. I'll just quickly take this moment to introduce myself. I'm the interviewer for the day, and My name is Santhan. I go by the pronouns they, them. I'm a science journalist and I'm currently associated with the independent feminist multimedia collective, thelifeofscience.com. I also teach writing and communication at Kriya University, Andhra Pradesh, and I write primarily at the intersections of science, health, gender, sexuality, and caste. It is, of course, my absolute honor to carry forward this conversation with Angela today, who's been a huge motivation for many of us struggling to find a critical voice in the science ecosystem, especially in the Indian science ecosystem. I'll introduce Angela briefly. Of course, one can go to her website, which is a lot more descriptive in terms of who she is and what her work is. But very briefly, she's an independent science journalist and author. She has written 3 books, the latest being the book that is going to be the center of our discussion today. It's called Superior, The Return of Race Science. I hope you can see the book as I'm holding it up. The book, released in 2019, was named Book of the Year by various media outlets. She also presents television, radio shows. Moreover, she's also the founder of the Challenging Pseudoscience group at the Royal Institution. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the discussion today, Angela. The way we are going to...
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, thank you. So I'll just quickly tell, for the benefit of our audience, how the process is going to look. I'm going to start talking to Angela with a few questions from my side, and I'm hoping the conversation will take 30 to 35 minutes, after which we are going to take questions from the audience. So I would request the audience to please put in your questions in the Q&A box, from where either me or one of the ISF moderators is going to pick them up. And if you have any comments, please use the chat box. And yeah, the ISF team is monitoring every platform where this is being streamed. So Angela, if we are ready, let me start by asking you a question that I think everybody is expecting to know more about at an interview like this, which is, what motivated you to write the 2 books, at least the 2 recent books? One is Inferior and the other is Superior. So if we can hear a little bit more about that.
Well, there were lots of different things. So the reason I got into journalism in the first place was partly because of my experiences growing up. When I was around 10 years old, my parents moved from a very multicultural part of London to a not very multicultural part of London that had a lot of far-right activity. So in the area where we lived, there had been a number of racist murders in the 80s and 90s. And that shaped my political awareness. And that was why when I went to university, so I studied engineering at university, but when I got there, I got involved in political activism and started writing on race and racism for the student press. And I think if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have become a journalist in the first place. So even though I have covered all kinds of topics in my career, I think it was inevitable that I would end up writing a book about race at some point, because it's been on my mind for 30 years or so, because of the experiences I had.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, even as I'm sure everybody is aware, we're also having a pretty drastic and rapid change in the political climate of India, where, you know, stuff is moving more and more towards far-right activism. We're going to see how that sort of impacts our politics and our writings. And I really hope it is indeed impacting our politics and our writings. But let me quote from your book, Superior, The Return of Race Science. You say, the more powerful we become, the more our power begins to be framed as not only cultural, but natural. Could you tell us a little bit more about this thought, please?
So for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working on a book looking at the origins of patriarchy, and it stemmed from work I'd already done on superior and inferior. And it's just become clearer to me that when we look at any system of oppression, any system of inequality, what we are seeing is, of course, power imbalance, but almost always where you have power imbalances or power hierarchies, there are attempts to naturalize them. So whether we're talking about race or gender or caste or class or anything, when you have an ingrained system of injustice like that, you will see the dominant group try to paint their position as something that is naturally given to them, whether divinely given to them or whether it is, biologically given to them, and very often kind of both of those things marry together. And we have, this is crucial to the understanding of human difference. When we study human difference in the present, for scientists, it's very tempting to treat it as a scientific question. But actually, any kind of grouping of individuals, I would argue, is to some extent a political act, and it has power embedded in it. And when we talk about nature, human nature, when we talk about group difference, I think what we're really talking about is that embedded power.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. So I've been recently very interested in the idea of building categories itself, right? How, science is really a business of categories. There's this constant motivation to build more categories. And what my observation has been that very rarely are these categories tested for their validity, right? So, people can make huge claims, both correlative and causative, about categories that we think are natural, for example, male versus female. And there are so much of correlative and causative science that has sort of proved, and we're sort of geared towards constantly saying that, okay, these are natural categories. And it's only probably since the late 1960s or so that we've a very strong feminist body of work within the sciences, and both within and outside the sciences, that has sort of told us that the very idea of categorization needs to be thought of as more critically, and categories need to be tested before you can find their correlation. So that helps a lot in the way we are thinking about it. So Angela, once again, quoting from your book, this is the foreword, the preface of your book. You say, as French President Nicolas Sarkozy said in 2007, the tragedy of Africa is that the African has not fully entered into history. There is neither room for human endeavor nor the idea of progress. The subtext is that the history is over, the fittest have survived, and that the victors have been decided. But history is never over. This makes me think about how science in its modern day practice seems to follow a similar trajectory, right? So you obtain a result in the lab or in the field. A problem is thought to be solved without taking into consideration the fact that science is a process. And we have very good examples, if you look at the history of science, which tells us that newer science, newer forms of doing science, newer knowledge systems have overthrown pre-existing beliefs. And that should probably be our, one can conclude from this that the practice of science, the pursuit of a question, is never over. So why do you think then that the culture of modern day science is geared towards coming up with a conclusion, which indicates an all-encompassing solution to a problem?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's quite a complex one. And I just want to come back to what you were saying before that about categorization. This is something that also has been exercising me a lot over the last few years, having written about gender and race and caste. I often get asked, are there better categories out there? And people will often say to me, well, we are using this label now. Is that better than the labels that we were using previously? Should we be using these categories instead? What is the more scientific category to choose? And what I always have to say is that I find this conversation about which categories should we be using to be a huge distraction, because there are no perfect categories. There are no natural categories out there. Every category, by its nature, because we are such a varied species, homogeneous on the one hand, in that we're genetically very similar to each other, but at the individual level, so different from one another, that any kind of categorization by its nature has to be, to some extent, at least arbitrary. Race is perhaps the most arbitrary of all. Caste is, of course, caste and class are very, very arbitrary. Gender, very arbitrary. Sex, some people would argue less arbitrary, but there's always a fudge. To some extent, there's always a fudge there. There are people who are let down by these forms of classification. But modern science rests on classification. Modern Western science was built on this idea that we can classify and then understand the differences between groups, not just when we're looking at the human species, but when we're looking at other flora and fauna. And that's how racial categories were invented in the first place, is that Enlightenment naturalists in Europe were classifying plants and animals, and they looked to us and said, can we also classify humans in this same way? And they came up with lots of different taxonomies. Color was just one of them. It's just an accident of fate, if you like, or an accident of politics that this has turned out to be the one that we've stuck with in most parts of the world. But it could have been anything. It could have been weight or height or lots of different things, but this is the one we've got. And it is as random as any other. In fact, I would argue more random than any other, because as we know from our own experience, we only have to look around us, that even within families, skin color can vary enormously. It's not some kind of fixed quantity. There are no black genes or white genes. The genes for skin color or skin tone vary hugely, and they're found all over the world. So I would, and this may sound quite radical, but I think I've come closer to this position of asking, why do we categorize at all? What purpose are we trying to serve here with this act of labeling, grouping, classification, and then finding differences between those groups of people? Now, of course, you might say, well, it may help with medicine, with medical treatments. Well, grouping by population is of almost no use whatsoever when you're talking about the individual. Polygenic risk scores and these big statistical differences you can find between population groups don't help you when you're looking at just one patient. So then the question is, then where is the utility here? And I wonder if the reason that scientists persist with this is because of this long legacy. This is where modern science started. We cannot imagine not grouping people and thinking about people in these terms. A more accurate science for me would be one that looks at people as individuals, that really understands the human species as a community of individuals rather than a community of groups. And I would hope, and that's a very difficult thing to do, of course, how do you study people in that way? But it would be a more rigorous, academic, scientific, accurate way of thinking about human difference, human variation. And my hope is that eventually we'll get there. So coming back to the second half of your question, around what Nicolas Sarkozy said, and of course he's not the only one. There have been so many politicians throughout history who have thought about this idea of group difference or Western cultural superiority, or whichever country they're in. I mean, ethnic nationalism exists all over the world. It's not just a European problem. It's a problem in India as well, ethnic and religious nationalism. But why do we do this? Why do we fall into this habit of believing that our group is better than another group? And why do we naturalize that? And it comes back to power. Like I said before, when you're a dominant group, you don't want to believe that you're dominant because of history or because of politics or because of things that you've done, possibly bad things that you've done. You want to believe that it is just because you are better deep down than other groups, and that you will always be dominant because of that. And that idea is already breaking down. Obviously, you can see the dominance of the West is falling, the rise of Asia and Africa, we are already seeing. History is already moving and changing. It's obviously not over. And as that happens, that's an affront to many people who have built their sense of self, their sense of dominance on this idea of racial superiority. And I think that partly explains the rise of ethnic nationalist movements and far-right movements, particularly in the West. It's this discomfort with knowing that that position which they thought had always been secure actually doesn't look so secure anymore. And it makes people question, well, then who are we really deep down? How can we believe ourselves to be the best in the world when we're clearly not?
Absolutely. Because you're talking about categorization, and I'm also thinking about how, the huge difference between the scientist and the experiment, the observer and the observed, is also a category that science thrives on. In the sense, and like you said, it's a question of power and authority, because by proving a natural truth, the scientist is sort of saying, in retrospect, it feels like it's a godlike move where you're discovering, secrets of the universe, as if the universe is holding some secret back, and you're a prodder and prober, this curious being that has so much power to extract the truth. And even in this language, I think there's a lot of power that goes in, right? The process of extraction is a process that's inherently linked to power. So what I strongly appreciate is that in our conversation, we are actually thinking about power, not just as a structure that influences science, but how science itself claims in its practice, in its methods, in its disciplinary structure, and claim to power. So I'd like to quote a little bit more from your book, because there's a pretty nice section that talks about how power works. And you say, this is how power works. It takes, it claims, and it keeps. It makes you believe that this is where they belong. It's designed to put you in your place. And the reason why this comment got me thinking is because, so science is, as a method of knowledge production, claims a lot of power, right? It asserts its superiority over other forms of knowledge production. It intends to uncover natural truths. And the natural part is very interesting. So, but scientists don't really discuss whether these natural truths, what we claim are natural truths, are embedded in nature. And we can go back to the example of male versus female categories, which we probably have pretty good arguments against now, or racial categories, for which both correlative and causative relationships have been drawn. So, my question simply is, who do you think science is trying to put in their place? What do you think science is trying to put in its place? Yeah.
It's interesting that you frame it that way, because as a science journalist, I see myself, and I have to stress here, I didn't start off my career as a science journalist. For the first 10 years, I was an everyday reporter. So I was covering politics and crime and all kinds of things in other areas. But when I came to science journalism, what I wanted to bring was that same element of speaking truth to power to science reporting, to my science reporting. And that's not to say other people haven't done it. Of course, other people do. But I saw my job as which power am I speaking truth to? And that power is science itself. It's the establishment of science. It's a body of individuals and institutions that claim to know who we are and tell us who we are and shape our understanding of ourselves. And that's a huge amount of responsibility that they then hold. The problem is when mistakes are made along the way. Race, obviously, scientific racism, eugenics, is the perfect example of how badly science can go wrong when politics and bias is affecting how individuals who are supposed to be doing something objective actually aren't objective at all. And that's the issue here, is how do we stop bias from interfering with that process of getting to the objective truth, to getting to universal facts about who we are. And it's almost impossible for it not to, because we are cultural creatures. Our perspectives are shaped by our experiences and how we look at the world around us. When a scientist tells me, I am perfectly objective, I am neutral, I don't have any political views, that's when I worry, because that means they aren't interrogating the bias in themselves. That means they aren't thinking about the ways in which they might be prejudicing the work that they're doing because of their personal views. We should all be able to say, every researcher should be saying, well, these are my perspectives, these are my biases, and this is what I'm going to do to try and make sure that it isn't affecting the way that I look at the world and the questions that I ask. And while there's many good scientists who do that, I don't see enough of it. And I wonder if that's partly because the way we think about science publicly, the way that we're taught it when we're at school, is as a set of rigid facts, that this is the truth about the world. And it is, once something is published, it becomes an unvarnished truth. And that is how we're taught science. We aren't taught the messy reality of correction, that mistakes are made and then they're corrected, and that's how science works. I would urge people, if you're interested, to please visit the website Retraction Watch, which is run by the brilliant science journalist Ivan Oransky here in New York. And what he and his team do is essentially catalogue papers that have been retracted for scientific journals because, for lots of different reasons, poor quality, sometimes because they're pseudoscientific, sometimes pseudoscientific for racist reasons or sexist reasons. And what looking at that shows you, and these are thousands of papers, you know, there's thousands of papers retracted every year, but looking at that shows you just how iterative the process of science actually is, and just how much there is personal bias involved in this process, not just of the political kind, but also around funding. And, you know, people have, there are bullies who work in different places. There are plagiarists, people who steal from each other within the sciences. So all the things that you see happening out there, outside science in the real world, are also happening within science. And what we do when we don't acknowledge that process of making mistakes and correction and bias and everything else is that we give a veneer of respectability sometimes to ideas that should have died a long time ago, including this idea that race is biologically real. And that involves a huge degree of vigilance. So the job of the scientist, I would argue, is not just to do their own research in the best and most objective way possible, but also to keep an eye on what other people are doing and make sure that stuff isn't slipping through the net that shouldn't be slipping through the net. Because there are deep problems there, I would argue.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. I was actually, so you were talking about the entire act of acknowledging biases, right? I think what's really interesting to me is that I think these ideas emerged somewhere around the 1970s when the feminist philosophers of science, Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway, two of them, really brought the standpoint theory to a point where it is articulating that for the betterment of your science, to make better scientific claims, it's important that the researcher declares the position from which those claims are made, the social locus from which those claims are made. And that seems to have been perceived as a conflict with the objectivity of the researcher and the objectivity of the scientific process. So that brings me to a very interesting question that I've had about objectivity, again, particularly because I've been thinking sort of critically in terms of science and science practice. So on one hand, science's, you know, its biggest strength seems to be objective, you know, to use methods that are not going to change as we move from people to people, researcher to researcher. And the fact that science is objective, one can draw from there a corollary that that essentially means it doesn't matter who you are as long as you're doing the same science, right? But at the same time, if you look at science practice, even with the very basic number crunching, I think what we observe is that science is inherently radically excluding a huge number of people. It's excluding people from marginalized races, marginalized castes, marginalized classes, marginalized genders, sexualities, abilities, and so on and so forth. So what do you think about this inherent contradiction? At least what I'm posing as a contradiction at this moment. Yeah,
there's no doubt that who gets to do science is one of the problems with research in the first place. So here in the US where I live, we know there have been studies that have shown that Black researchers are denied opportunities and funding even when they have the same level of qualification and experience and accolades as other researchers. So there is discrimination in that process. We only need to look at the demographics of science to know that there must be discrimination in this process. There's actually a very good movie, when we're talking about sex and gender, there's a very good movie called Picture a Scientist, which came out, I think, more than a year ago, a documentary based in North America looking at the experiences of women scientists over the last 50 years and quite shocking levels of sexual harassment and abuse that they've suffered that forces some of them out of the sciences, that really help you to understand what is the problem here. This illusion of meritocracy, you know, that science is some kind of nice, cuddly place. When you work in academia, you know that that's not true. You only have to, you know, there is no academic I know who believes in that myth. So there is a lot, you know, that houses have to be put in order here. And in India too, we know that undergraduates, graduates, professors overwhelmingly come from upper caste backgrounds. That has a huge impact on, the kind of research that is done, the kind of questions that are asked. When I was writing Superior, one of the chapters looks at caste, and I was interviewing Indian geneticists who was telling me that caste was biologically meaningful, that certain castes were suited to certain jobs. There is no research basic, there is no data for that. There is absolutely no biological evidence for that. And yet they were convinced that they would be able to find the proof of that one day. And that is no different from here in the US, people claiming that there are profound natural IQ differences between races. It's the same, it comes from the same place. And the experience and the background of the researcher then, I think, really does matter. So we do need a broadening here, but we also need to understand that having more diversity in and of itself is not some panacea. I often see ethnic minority scientists falling into the trap of thinking about race in a biological way. I often see, women scientists looking at sex and gender and making very essentialist claims around sex and gender. So it's not that, diversity somehow fixes everything, that somehow we get a more broad and opened up blue sky way of thinking about science. It does help, but what we also need is a fundamental rethink about what is the utility of science, what values is it trying to serve, what assumptions are we starting with. And Western science, we have to understand, modern science, however you want to term it, has started with certain assumptions, including this idea that humans can be classified and grouped. And that is one we haven't fully interrogated, along with many others. So it's that really going back to the basic questions of what is science for, what are we trying to prove here, that I think also needs to be done, as well as more inclusivity.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely very helpful as we think about these questions about diversity and inclusion. It's now becoming a buzzword over time, although we don't see as much happening. One can also think about it in more intersectional ways, in the sense that while many institutes are open to the idea of hiring, at least in India, and it's an observation at this moment. But I've seen that many institutions are happy to are open to discussions around, okay, how do we hire more women? But these very institutions deny any kind of caste inclusion when we come to that, right? So these are very same institutions who have acknowledged that there's a bias in at least one kind of categorization, one form of social marginalization access. But these very same institutions are not open to other forms of similar conversations. And I think it's partly because, when let's say you go to a very posh Indian science institution and you say, okay, all of you are Savarna Brahmins, the first response is, yeah, but we do science. And the moment you're going to hire or take in people from other castes, that just means our merit is going to go down. And as far as I understand, there's probably no definition of merit. Definitely a very, very arbitrary way of thinking about merit.
Yeah, but also it implies that you would somehow have to lower your standards in order to achieve the diversity that you want, which is fundamentally offensive. Absolutely. Because it implies that everybody else is not as is inherently not going to be as qualified as you are. I've heard that myself. I've heard people make that claim that we want diversity, but we also want to maintain standards. Well, actually, your standards are likely to go up if you have a wider pool of candidates from a wider group. And just look at, the scientists who fail, who sexually harass, who abuse. They come from all kinds of different backgrounds, and yet what is shocking to me sometimes, and if you watch Picture of Scientists, you'll just see how profound this problem is that there is more effort that goes into sometimes keeping abusers and harassers in their jobs than there is in supporting their victims and making sure that their careers in science thrive and are sustained.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite, in a sense, it's making me think about a lot of stuff that I've been playing around in my head, but not been able to articulate. So you're providing me words to articulate many of these thoughts. So Thank you for all the discussion. I think I'd like to ask you a question, and I confess that it might be too early to ask this question, but you're working on a new book, like you rightly said, in the origins of patriarchy. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about it? Give us a sneak peek, if possible.
It is nearly finished. I'm just working on the last chapter now. I've been working on it for more than 2 years. There's still, I'm filing it in the summer, and then there'll still be a process of editing. So in the end, it will be three years of work, which is longer than I've spent on any of my previous books. And it is a much bigger book. And it's a very difficult question. It's something that hasn't really been looked at in book length for more than 30 years, this question of how, if we haven't always been male dominated as species, how did societies become so patriarchal? Not universally. I mean, there are some societies that are more egalitarian, that even lean towards the more matrilineal and matriarchal in some places. But, by and large, these patriarchal societies. And it's been a very, very tough question. Not least because you have to counter this assumption that's already embedded in the literature, including the feminist literature, actually, that male domination is somehow natural to our species. I mean, it's such a widespread assumption that's made that equality is somehow a recent invention, that this is something new that is happening, when in fact, the further back you go in history, you actually see far more social variation in how people lived, including in egalitarian societies and in lots of different ways. So again, this is, I think, about power. But I think the point I also want to make in this book, and I've tried very hard to do this, is to show that patriarchy isn't just about gender. And it isn't just about men and women. It is about a system of oppression that is interlocked with all different systems of oppression in which women are also invested. And that is what causes, I think that's what gives it the rigidity that it's had. That's why it has felt such an intractable problem, that we work so hard to smash the patriarchy. We don't seem to be making progress as fast as we want to. And the reason is that all these other systems of oppression are kind of locked into it. And in the end, we have to recognize it from the beginning, not as sexual oppression only, but as gendered oppression. It is, I think, tied up with also categorization and the erasing of multiple identities.
Right. It's a pleasure to hear more about the book, and I'm sure you'll have many people who are willing to read it and engage with it, and I really hope you do. My best wishes, all our best wishes on the same. So I think it's time that I make a move towards audience questions, and like I promised, I think we've been speaking for about 25 minutes or so. One of the questions that somebody wrote to me when we were sharing the poster on social media is more about the process of your writing. So how do you find and choose your sources while working on a book? In the case of multiple experts, how do you choose one?
Well, number one, I never choose just one. When I'm looking at a question, and this is particularly true when you're looking at the science of human difference, everyone disagrees with each other in the same field. It's very rare that I'll find, 2 or 3 experts that all are on exactly the same page. So I have to speak to lots of different people. And I try, as frustrating as that might be for the reader, I try to explain the ambiguities there within the science that are reflected in the fact that researchers disagree. And I've come to the point, especially in this book I'm currently writing, that the ambiguity is actually quite beautiful in itself. It's when you see the uncertainty that you really unlock the fact that human nature, as much as we are so desperate to define it, is almost an undefinable thing. It is always moving. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because we as a species are not just driven by some kind of animal nature. We are cultural, deep down culturally, a cultural species. Our brains, if there's one thing that marks our human brains out from other primates, is that they are plastic even into adulthood. So our brains are always changing. The experience of life is affecting our brains and shaping the way our brains structurally even look. So the culture is reflected in our bodies. It's, you know, it's there viscerally in our bodies. And that is something you can never account for in some kind of universal, timeless portrait of human nature. There are, of course, some truths that I'm sure it might be possible to get to. But I think the reason that people struggle to kind of define human nature in a very fixed and discrete way is because we are always changing and always moving. And there is such huge individual variation between us. I'm not sure we're even aware of the extent of that capacity we have to live in so many different ways. And that's also what gives me hope. You know, I write about systems of injustice. And what always gives me hope when we're thinking about the fight for equality or the fight for a better world is that I've seen, witnessed with my own eyes, but also I can see in the research, we can live pretty much any way we want. There is nothing really in our biology holding us back from building whichever society that we want. So this idea that somehow we are constrained by human nature to live in these very unequal ways, in the ways that we are now, I think is just not borne out by the evidence.
Thank you for the answer. Somebody from the audience is quoting a part of Inferior, and I'm going to read that out to you, and who needs an elaboration on what you're saying there. So I'm quoting, feminism can be a friend to science. It not only improves how science is done by pushing researchers to include the female perspective, but science in turn can also show us that we are not as different as we see. Would you elaborate on the same?
Well, you know, there has been this ongoing debate within the sciences around politicization of science. You know, after Black Lives Matter a couple of years ago, there were a number of op-eds that were written arguing that anti-racism activism shouldn't be part of science because science is not about politics. It sits above and outside of politics. And what that ignores, of course, is the politics that was embedded within the science from the beginning. The racial categories that we use were invented by scientists and then built on by scientists, even though they were complete nonsense. So if we can't see that the politics was there, then how are we ever going to challenge it? And this is what Darwinian feminists and feminist scientists have done, is they have challenged the politics that is already there. They have asked questions that hadn't been asked before about female inferiority, about, you know, why do we think about humans in this way? What queer scholars have done is challenge that fundamental binary on which Western science is built and say, actually, can we think beyond that? What you think of as normal, can you expand the umbrella of that and think and instead of pathologizing things, see it maybe as part of natural human variation? So actually, I think it's important to bring politics into science, because how else do you challenge the politics that is already there within the science to begin with? If you don't bring in feminism and critical race theory and queer theory and all these other systems of thinking from the social sciences, then frankly, you're just perpetuating the mistakes of the past.
Right. You know, because we're talking about how this entire detachment of science from politics and this claim that's pretty often comes in, right? I mean, so I remember when I was doing my undergrad in Presidency University, Calcutta, there was this big thing about people from the science departments not being as involved in student movements because, you know, we have other things to do. We're supposed to be working in the lab, solving important questions, while politics is the work of social sciences and humanities. But if you actually look at the history of, let's say, anti-reservation protests in India, right? So you can look at 2000, and then you can look at the other anti-reservation protests that have happened. Very interestingly, these anti-reservation protests have been led by IITs, AIMS, to institutions that can be as quote-unquote relevant to the sciences in India as possible. And the entire thing has been that you're making us do worse science. The stature of the institute is going to fall. So this is one of the things that I often say to people who believe that science is apolitical, that there's nothing apolitical about this entire claim of being apolitical. It's as political as a claim that's possible. So let me move on to a next question. So somebody is asking anonymously if Angela could recall her experiences with merit and how it was interpreted while she was working on the Geek Nation book, which was based in India.
Merit. So I studied engineering at Oxford, and I spent a little bit of time when I was researching Geek Nation at IIT Delhi. And it was, in some ways, the experience was reminiscent of when I had been an undergrad, because I was one of very few women in those lecture theatres. There are so few women in these places, girls or women in these places. But also, I'm a geek myself. I'm a nerd. I'm not ashamed to say that. But these are nerdy places. What disappointed me a little bit about IIT Delhi, and I've heard this also said about some of the other engineering colleges in India, is that at that time, and this is an old book now, this is more than 10 years old, but at that time, there wasn't this idea, or there wasn't this sense of creativity that was being nurtured so much. There were attempts to bring it in, but it was really about, how much can you remember? How fast can you do calculations in your head? So a lot of the kids that were doing very well tended to be ones who just had a very good memory and just, through tutoring or rote learning, just remembered a huge amount of stuff and could repeat it when it came to the exam. And of course, science and engineering is about more than that. It's about thinking outside the box and being creative and thinking of solutions that aren't there. And I wonder if some of the issues that we have, for example, in Silicon Valley, is because the engineering environment, and this is true all over the world. I mean, I saw it even in my own training when I was at university. It kind of is quite binary. It doesn't think in that kind of broader way. Politics and history are so rarely brought in anyway when science and engineering are taught. But I think they would benefit from that. A lot of the sexism of Silicon Valley, for instance, I think is rooted in this idea that these guys who think they're so clever look at the world around them, don't see many women, and assume that women can't do what they're doing. They don't see the kind of reasons embedded in why the world looks the way it does. And they feel themselves to be so clever that they must be right, that they know best because they've been told their entire lives that they're so smart. That is something you have to be trained out of. And in fact, I internalized some of that. When I was at school, I was the only girl in some of my classes because of the subject choices that I made. And that's not to say that there weren't many brilliant girls at my school. The girls performed as well, if not better than the boys academically. But because I chose to go down the physics route, I was one of the few girls in many of my classes. And again, when I went to university, I was the only girl in my college in my year doing engineering in a class of 9 or 10. And I did internalize this idea that maybe I was different from other women. Maybe I thought differently from other women. And it was only the process of writing Inferior that helped me challenge that and say to myself, well, no, it's not because you're different, Angela. You made different choices because you were fortunate enough to grow up in an environment. My dad was an engineer. He studied engineering at Punjab University, and he brought us up in an environment in which we were told, me and my sisters, there's absolutely nothing we couldn't do. And other girls were not getting that message. They were getting completely different messages. I didn't realize that until much later. So to some extent, I'm the product of that system. That's why I can understand why it causes the problems that it does. And it took me a long time to educate myself into recognizing why it looks the way it does. And I wish that other people would get that same education, that broader education.
It's wonderful to hear this. So I remember in, I think, Cyborg Manifesto, which is Donna Haraway's feminist philosopher of science, Donna Haraway, her 1978 or 1985 sometime. A nice essay, very interestingly written essay, where actually even Haraway tracks her lineage as something that's sort of so crucial to building her up, and she really links it to the fact that she's not only a product of her disciplinary training, but how because certain events in the Cold War enabled somebody from her background to be able to sort of come and study sciences in the US, is So essentially, she claims to be a product, at least partly a product of even war. And I think many of us are really, I'm probably a product of casteism and colonialism as much as I'm a product of my science training. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that we are all products of some of the other social structures and social politics that have happened previously. I have one final question that I'll take up from the audience, and another question that we are asking everybody in our panel, and then I think we can close. So the final question from the audience is, Indian STEM seems to have multiple layers of oppression, and what are some ways that journalists can address these?
Oh, it's very difficult. And one of the things that worries me a little bit about the direction that identity politics sometimes takes when we're covering it is that it can be very easy to fall into lazy assumptions. So, for example, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was this myth that was circulating, which wasn't completely nonsensical, that women had a kind of immunity edge to the virus, that they were somehow less likely to get it. And this was covered, a paper was published on this in Nature about it. And it was only this year, so a year later, that the Gender Sci Lab at Harvard, which I hugely recommend, it's run by this wonderful scholar, Harvard scholar, Sarah Richardson, investigated this claim. And they said, actually, does the data support this claim that women are less likely to catch COVID for innate immune reasons? And there was no data to support it. They couldn't find it. And so they wrote their own paper in Nature, which was published this year. And I think what that claim, which I saw, it was very widespread at the beginning of the pandemic. And what I think that shows is that we're so quick to jump to essentialist explanations for the data that we see. We're so keen to believe that there must be some fundamental differences there, that even very well-intentioned feminist thinkers can sometimes fall into this trap of believing things that just aren't true, that of building I hesitate to say conspiracy theory, but sometimes they are conspiracy theories because they are not based in fact. This belief that there is some kind of, that this is where the roots of women's disadvantages lie. When it comes to health, for instance, another claim that's often made is that, and this is something I talk about in Inferior, that women are underrepresented in clinical trials. Well, that was true in the past. Women were underrepresented. But for the last 20 years in the US and Europe, the rules around who can be included in clinical trial has changed. I was reading a paper in a major journal published not that long ago, just a few years ago, that repeated this claim that women are underrepresented in clinical trials, and that's the root of women's health problems, that our bodies are so different that by not including women in clinical trials, they're somehow let down. And it had one reference. So I went to that reference for where this claim came from. And the paper actually said exactly the opposite. For the last 20 years, from the data that they had, and of course, it's not all publicly available clinical trial data, but the data that they had from the FDA in the US showed that actually there were more women. There were a higher percentage of women in clinical trials than men. And there was a small percentage also of people whose gender was not declared. And the paper itself asserted the importance of looking not just at sex, this binary idea of sex when we're thinking about health disparities, but also saying, how can we include non-binary, transgender people in this picture of health difference and, this portrait of health difference that we're trying to paint? And still I hear it, even today, I still hear people saying women are underrepresented in clinical trials, drugs that are tested on men don't work in women, which is absolute nonsense. There are sometimes small discrepancies in efficacy for men and women, but there are so few drugs for which that is true. And for one of the major ones, Zolpidem, for instance, which is an insomnia drug. So this is a drug that the FDA gave different doses for men and women. It wasn't because women were fundamentally different. It was based on size and weight. So studies show that because women are on average a little bit smaller than men, that's why the drug behaved differently, which means the difference here should not be based on sex. It should be based on weight, that if you're a bit larger, you should take a different dose. And if you're a bit smaller, you should take a different dose, irrespective of gender. And these are the kind of fine-grained details I think we really, as journalists, need to investigate. The Gender Scilab is doing wonderful work here on really breaking down some of those myths and ideas that circulate on social media. I mean, social media is the enemy of good information, good scientific information. But I would urge people to not just look at the top line and assume that they know exactly what's going on there, to really dig deeper and try and get to the heart of why the differences that we see are actually there. It's not always to do with race or sex. Sometimes there is something else, completely something else going on.
Right. I'm sure we should all take note of it. Yeah, I mean, I think to really sum up what you've spoken about science journalism, and something that I've tried to think about quite a bit is, I mean, I'm too early in my career to make very broad claims about science journalism, but something that I've been very practicing very fiercely is to really be as critical as I can in my approach. And I do see journalism as a field that allows me to do that. It's not limited to just taking a piece of work from an ivory tower and making it more accessible, but also producing new knowledge through a critical engagement with that work. And I hope to do better at it over time. Final question, which is, what do you think is the role of platforms like Indian Science Festival to propagate conversations like this one, the one that we've been having?
Oh, I think it's crucial. And I'm so grateful that you invited me to be in conversation with you today. It's been wonderful. I only wish I could have been there in person, because one of the great things about conferences, of course, is not just these panels and debates, but all the chats that you have with other people in between. And I can't have any of those, and I just wish that I could.
Absolutely. I wish we all could, and hopefully next year when India Science Festival happens, we have an in-person conference. We are all able to see and meet each other better. But with that note, Angela, I must thank you for joining us today and for sharing and very patiently answering all the questions, which I admit that many of them were not very easy or not very, and they were quite complex, but I also sort of took this opportunity to ask questions that I genuinely had in my mind. I'm glad I did that. And I'm also sorry for the audience questions that I couldn't take up. In case, Angela, if you're interested, you can answer some of them in the Q&A box. But from my side, that's it. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much, Angela.
Oh, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, Shantan. It was an absolute pleasure hosting you at the festival. The first day of the festival it really ended on a really wonderful note. And Angela, we would have loved to host you live on ground, offline. But we're really hopeful that we'll be able to do that in the coming years. And we would really enjoy your presence at the festival. We would love for our attendees to interact with you on a personal level, because there's just so much that we all have to learn from each other, and this conversation has been absolutely enriching. So thank you to both of you. Shantan, thank you for so kindly in being a part of this festival and interviewing Angela and providing so much more nuance to the conversation. So thank you to both of you. Thank you so much for joining.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. To all of our attendees, thank you for coming in. And we have just come to the end of our day one of the festival. I would just like to tell you all that we have a social media contest running on Twitter. So please make sure to take screen grabs and tag us on Twitter and tell us what you really liked about our events. There is the contest gives out prizes to the most exciting tweets. So make sure to participate in the same. We have a lot of events lined up for everyone in the next 15 days. We have talks, panel discussions, workshops, demonstrations, contests, and all of it is absolutely free to attend and just a click away. All of our events run on Zoom. All you need to do is go over to our website, click on whichever events interest you. There's a checkbox that you will find right next to the events on the program schedule. Just make sure that you add them, just register for them, and they'll get added to your calendar, and we'll send you updates about all of our events. For the workshops, there are Google Forms that you need to fill out, very small ones. Do avail of all of these opportunities. Everything is free to attend, and it's a great chance to learn more skills and network and participate and essentially celebrate science with us at India Science Festival. With that, we've come to the end of the first day, and I sincerely hope that you'll all join us for the next 15 days. It's going to be packed with a lot of fun events, so don't miss out on this opportunity. And we also have a feedback form that is going to be dropped in the chat box. Please do tell us what you liked about our events or didn't like about our events. We're very keen to improve in the coming years, and we'll take your feedback very, very seriously and work on making our events more meaningful and useful for all of you. We have a very exciting panel discussion tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. In partnership with our knowledge partners, Asian Century Foundation. The panel discussion is going to look at what role science and technology has played in revolutionizing economies from an Asian perspective. And we have panelists joining us all the way from Indonesia and Japan. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. So please do make sure to tune in. All of our events run on the same Zoom link. So the ones that you have joined today are the ones that will stay throughout the festival. If there are any events that you miss out, you can head over to our YouTube channel and watch the live streams that are up on the channel. And do make sure that you tune into our Zoom events to interact with the speakers. Some of our events also have a breakout room wherein speakers engage with some of our attendees. So do stay tuned for all of these. And make sure to tune in on the 15th of January. We have a quiz running with Kumar Varun. It's going to be full of fun, full of humor. It's going to be power packed. There are going to be very cool lifelines in the quiz too. And we've tried to make it as interactive as possible. So please make sure to tune in on the 15th too. And we have some talks on mental health. We are covering talks on wildlife conservation, consciousness, blockchain technology, artificial intelligence. We have a very cool robotics demonstration. So a professor is going, Professor Setu Kumar from Edinburgh is going to show us a live demonstration of a humanoid robot right from his lab. And I think that's going to be super exciting. So please make sure to tune in for that session too. We have a variety of sessions for kids. So families, parents, guardians in the Zoom room, please do check out our events for kids on the website. There are some very exciting webinars and workshops that we have lined up exclusively for kids. So please do register for them, and let's make sure that our kids have a very fun-filled time even during the pandemic. Stay home, everyone, stay safe, and do tune in whenever possible. There are a few questions that I think Angela is addressing in the chat box right now. So we can, so we'll just stay put for a bit. And if you have any queries at all, please leave them in the Q&A box, and we'll address them. Do check out our events on our social media handles. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and our YouTube channel, of course, is also showing all of our events live. So do follow us on all of these platforms, and stay tuned and stay updated with all of our events. And with that, we've come to the end. I think Angela has left. So thank you for joining in, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. The first event starts at 10 a.m. So make sure to stay tuned for that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Keep celebrating